Hello everyone, this is Alan G., your host of Historical Crime Chronicles. Yes, we changed the name, and the reason being is starting to slow down a little bit in subscribers, and a lot of people, when they make comments, they say, oh, you ought to have 1 million subscribers. Well, hopefully this will help. Welcome to tonight's Halloween marathon. Yes, I took a few episodes, past episodes, and put them together in a marathon, but there will be some new episodes coming up pretty soon. If you like what you see, hit like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you'll be notified of any future episodes that come your way. And if you'd like to support us, we're on PayPal and buy me a cup of coffee, or you can donate to us directly. My address is truecrimemdi@gmail.com. We hope you enjoy it. This is not a new episode, but like I said, it's a marathon. It's about 3 hours long. I thought I would do that. Normally I do a live stream, but I haven't really had a lot of time to do that lately because of my full-time employment. So here you go with your marathon. I hope you enjoy it. Please leave some comments in the comment section, and we'll see you pretty soon. Happy Halloween. Materials used in this presentation are period in nature and used for educational and entertainment purposes. Furthermore, videos have been used in conjunction with the photographs to produce continuity, in some instances are composites, and fall within the purview of the fair use doctrine of U.S. copyright laws. Attributions are given when required.
Welcome to the True Crime Man's Dark Imagination YouTube channel, your source for interesting and factual crime. Please like, share, subscribe, and hit the bell so you can stay up to date on any future programs.
The following episode is a remix of the first presentation that ever appeared on True Crime Man's Dark Imagination. Some changes have been made to reflect historical accuracy and any current developments which may have occurred since the first broadcast. As the United States entered the war in Europe, the citizens of the country waved goodbye to sons, husbands, and loved ones on their way to the Western Front to, quote, fight for democracy, end quote. The life in the Big Easy of New Orleans seemed a welcome distraction from the war. But among the nighttime shadows of the city, a killer surfaced who demanded appeasement from the residents of that city. This killer proved dastardly, diabolical, sociopathic, and psychotic. He held the city hostage for over 18 months, but those who tried to catch him never realized that his crimes may have gone back more than 8 years before. The dark days of the Axman still generate a morbid fascination with the macabre and foment fear amongst the locals who first hear of the reign of terror of this serial killer for the first time. The world would continue to see the brutality of such attacks, and even worse, as the allure of serial murder would permeate the human psyche. The most popular historical acceptance of the beginning of the Axman occurred at approximately 4:30 a.m. on the morning of May 23, 1918. A low moaning sound roused Jacob Maggio from his sound sleep. When Jake arose from his bed, he awoke his other brother, Andrew, from a drunken stupor where he was celebrating being called into the service of his country. Jake and Andrew stumbled through the house located at 4901 Magnolia Street in Midtown New Orleans, and when they opened the door to the room that their brother Joseph shared with his wife Catherine, the two men shrieked in horror. Catherine and Joseph lay in a pool of blood on the bed. Catherine lay groaning with a large gash on the side of her head. Joseph, with the same wounds, lay dead. Jake and Andrew immediately called for the police and an ambulance to assist with Mrs. Maggio, but she later died of her wounds. Captain John Drum was the first watch commander to arrive on the scene and noticed that an empty strongbox lay opened on the floor. Captain Drum surmised that the Maggios had been victims of a robbery gone badly. Captain Drum also noticed that one of the bottom panels of the back door adjacent to the Maggios' bedroom had been chiseled out. Captain Drum further surmised that more witnesses should have come forward due to the loud banging it would have taken to loosen the panel to break into the house. Dr. Joseph O'Hara, the coroner for Orleans Parish, determined that the Maggios succumbed to, quote, external and internal hemorrhages of the head and brain, end quote. Additionally, it appeared that both victims suffered from their throats being cut with a razor. Later that day, two New Orleans detectives, Theodore Obitz and Harry Dodson, stumbled across a chalk message in the sidewalk near the murder scene. The cryptic writing stated, quote, Mrs. Maggio is going to sit up late tonight just like Miss Tony, end quote. The message did not appear to make sense to either of the gumshoes, but they copied down the exact wording anyway. Andrew and Jake Maggio were arrested and brought to the 7th District Police Station for questioning. Despite being hungover and barely coherent, Andrew Maggio withstood the incessant questioning from police after they discovered the razor used to slice the throats of Joseph and Catherine belonged to the slowly sobering Andrew. The police later released the two brothers, but a rumor circulated throughout the city that the mafia was involved in the Maggio murder. Subsequently, authorities learned that something more diabolical was afoot. On the morning of June 28, 1918, a baker by the name of John Zanka walked up to the door of Dorgenois and La Harpe Streets, where he was to make a delivery at the grocery store run by Louis Bessemer. When Zanka received no response from his knocking on the front door, he went to the side alley to try that entranceway. Zanka noticed in the dimly lit alley that one of the panels at the bottom of the door appeared missing. Zanka prepared to knock again when suddenly Louis Bessemer answered the door with blood running down his face from a gash in his head. Bessemer claimed that the, quote, Axman, end quote, had visited he and his mistress, Harriet Lowe, in the middle of the night and wounded her badly as well. When police arrived, they noticed a pool of blood, but no Harriet. She received her wounds at one spot and then dragged herself to the bedroom where she lay unconscious. In the bathroom, the police discovered a bloody axe leaning against one of the walls of the tub. Diluted blood and water stood at the bottom of the tub. On the following day, authorities chose to approach the Bessemer case with a slight difference from the Maggios. While looking for clues to the attack on Bessemer and Lowe, the police discovered letters Bessemer had written in German and Yiddish. Authorities deduced that Bessemer was a German spy and therefore asked for the assistance from federal authorities. The Bessemer attack proved to be a, quote, red herring, end quote, and had nothing to do with the Axman whatsoever. Louis Bessemer even requested that he be allowed to investigate his own case. Mrs. Lowe recovered, and it turned out to be just a lover's quarrel that turned violent. Because detectives advocated that the Bessemer case had Axman signatures, Police Superintendent Frank Mooney demoted 2 detectives. The city remained free from any nocturnal attacks, at least until August 5th. Mrs. Edward Schneider lay in her bed resting on that muggy August night. Her husband worked nights and left her alone with their 3 children while he performed his job duties. As she lay on the bed, 9 months pregnant, her 3 children slept in the next room. When she opened her eyes briefly, she noticed a dark figure standing over her. The figure then struck her with something in the face, knocking out 2 front teeth and rendering her unconscious. Once the police brought her to Charity Hospital, Mrs. Schneider regained consciousness and became hysterical, believing that she would lose her baby. The trauma of the attack caused her to go into labor. When the child was born, there were no effects from the attack, and both baby and mother recovered from the excitement. After an extensive search of the house, detectives discovered the axe missing from the family's tool shed. 5 days later, police were called to the residence of another grocer, Joseph Romano. When they arrived, the authorities found the lifeless and bloodied body of the grocer barber. The police found no evidence suggesting the identity of the perpetrator, but 2 witnesses, Pauline, aged 18, and her sister Mary, aged 13, lay in bed trying to sleep and heard nothing of the attack on their uncle. Pauline stated that she awoke at approximately 3 a.m. and saw what she thought to be the shadow of a tall man standing near her door. Just then, her uncle, Mr. Romano, stumbled into the girl's room and appeared to be dazed with blood running from a deep wound in the scalp. Romano then went into the next room and slumped into the chair where he stated, "Something has happened. My head hurts. Call for an ambulance." The Axman had attacked 2 families and left 3 dead in his wake. Police tried desperately to determine what type of individual could have been responsible for the terror. Detective John D'Antonio, an experienced investigator who worked the Walter Lamanna murder case some 11 years before, sought to identify the characteristics of the killer in an interview to the local newspapers.
"I am convinced the man is of a dual personality, and it is very probable he is the man we tried so hard to get 10 years ago, when a series of axe and butcher knife murders was committed within a few months. My opinion is based on experience and a study of criminology. Criminals such as the ones like the Axman are on the order of Jack the Ripper, who some years ago terrorized London. They are cunning and hard to catch. I've never known the mafia to kill women. In fact, you could not get a mafia agent to murder a woman under any circumstances."
The attacks that Detective D'Antonio referenced occurred between 1910 and 1917. In the early morning hours of August 14, 1910, Mr. August Crudy and his wife settled in for the night in the apartment above their grocery store located at the corner of Lesseps and Royal Streets. Crudy often suffered from an upset stomach, and in the early morning hours of the 14th, Crudy awoke after laying down for approximately a half an hour. Crudy got out of bed and walked to the backyard of the residence in the hopes that the night air would relieve his discomfort. He returned to bed next to his wife and fell asleep at approximately 1 a.m. At approximately 3 a.m., Mrs. Crudy awoke to find a large dark figure standing next to her bed holding what appeared to be a meat cleaver. The figure demanded money, and Mrs. Crudy obliged the demand. When Mrs. Crudy asked for her husband, she then shook August, and when he turned over, bled from massive gashes in his head. When August tried to raise himself up from the bed, the assailant struck him again with the cleaver, and Mr. Crudy fell off the bed with the force of the blow. The attacker soon fled after the strike. Surprisingly, August Crudy recovered from his wounds, but never forgot the actions from that night. Police had no leads as to the mysterious assailant. 5 weeks later, on September 21, 1910, Mr. and Mrs. Joseph Rosetto, who owned a grocery store at the corner of London and Tonti Avenues, suffered a brutal attack by a mysterious stranger, and once authorities made it to the crime scene, they feared the Rosettos would not survive. Fortunately, the Rosettos did survive the attack and would later reunite in the hospital. Again, the police had no leads or suspects. For over a year, the city remained quiet regarding the phantom assailant. Then on September 21, 1911, Joseph Dobby and his wife were attacked while they slept in the small apartment they owned behind their grocery store at 2425 Galvez Street. The first blow struck Mr. Dobby over the head and fractured his skull. Mrs. Dobby received deep cuts on her nose and hands. Mr. Dobby succumbed to his wounds, and Mrs. Dobby stated that, quote, she would devote the balance of her life to find the murderer or murderers of her husband, end quote. Even averring to find the killers, Mrs. Dobby could not identify the assailant or assailants that killed her husband. The killer remained silent for 8 months, and then, on May 12, 1912, Corporal George Duffy of the 5th Precinct received a telephone call from a Fred Stegelmeyer who resided at 4212 Villeray Street. Stegelmeyer claimed to the young officer that he heard gunshots coming from a barroom owned by Anthony J. Chambra and his wife, Johanna, at the corner of France and Villeray Streets. Corporal Duffy proceeded to the Chambra residence, and when he opened the door to the residence behind the barroom, he found Anthony Chambra nude with gunshot wounds to the back. His wife, Johanna, lay unconscious from a gunshot wound to the hip. Corporal Duffy tried to question Miss Chambra when she could barely sustain consciousness, but she could not identify the assailant. Anthony Chambra died at the scene. Mrs. Chambra died from her wound a few days later. Almost 5 years later, on Saturday morning, December 22, 1917, Epitana Andolina and his two sons, John and Salvador, suffered from wounds they sustained during a hatchet attack at their residence and place of business at 8301 Apple Street. Mrs. Andolina first saw the intruder and gave the alarm with a loud scream, alerting the others to the presence of a stranger standing near the foot of her bed. The assailant struck Mr. Andolina in the head, and when his sons intervened, they received wounds as well. The intruder then escaped. No one could give a credible description of the assailant. When Antonio reminded the populace of the city of the previous murders and attacks, Superintendent of Police Frank Mooney began in earnest to find the killer. He studied the previous cases and noticed that the killings escalated in the ferocity. With no other leads to follow, the police had nothing to do but wait until another attack occurred. This would never be more certain. In an effort to allay the fears of the residents of New Orleans, on August 19, 1918, a local supermarket used the murders to advertise specials at their store. Although, indeed, in bad taste, the newspaper advertisement displayed the morbid sense of humor used as a coping mechanism by the citizens of the city. The new year passed without much fanfare, but on March 9, 1919, the Axman struck again. On the west bank of the Mississippi River is the small hamlet known as Gretna. Charles Cortimiglia normally opened his grocery store at the corner of Jefferson and 2nd Streets early in the morning. Hazel Jackson, a neighbor of the Cortimiglia family, tried to get someone to answer the door, but to no avail. Jackson then went to the side alley and knocked on the door there. Jackson noticed that a chair was under the bedroom window where Mr. and Mrs. Cortimiglia slept. Jackson also noticed that the back door had one of its panels missing. She ran from the house and then immediately notified the police. When authorities arrived at the Cortimiglia residence, they found the lifeless body of 2-year-old Mary Cortimiglia. Mr. and Mrs. Cortimiglia had been attacked after their little girl, but they clung to life. Mrs. Cortimiglia cried uncontrollably for her deceased child. When police located the bloody axe used on the Cortimiglias under the front steps of their house, little clumps of hair and brain were discovered on the blade. While in the hospital, Mrs. Cortimiglia identified 17-year-old neighbor Orlando Gugliardo Jr. as her assailant. Gugliardo's father, Orlando Gugliardo Sr., was also identified as an accomplice. Mrs. Cortimiglia used to work for Mr. Gugliardo and left his employ to start a business of her own across the street. Mrs. Cortimiglia convinced her husband to start another business in order to put the Gugliardos out of business. Subsequently, the two men stood trial and were found guilty. But later, Mrs. Cortimiglia had an epiphany and decided to tell the truth about the Gugliardos, recanting her accusations against the father and the son. They were immediately released and the charges against them dropped. Superintendent Mooney gave a candid interview to the local media where he expressed his beliefs as to the character of the murderer. As these axe murders have grown in number, I've been forced to the belief that they are the work of a madman. I am convinced that the murders are the work of an axe-wielding degenerate who has no robbery motive, but who has taken small sums to throw the police off the track. I further believe he is a sadist, and he crawls through the panel of the door. After going into the house, he opens the door. To add further mystique to the identity of the killer, on March 16, 1919, the local newspaper, the Times-Picayune, received a cryptic letter that appeared to taunt the police. The letter read in its entirety:
Hell, March 13, 1919. Esteemed mortal of New Orleans, they have never caught me and they never will. They have never seen me, for I am invisible, even as the ether that surrounds your earth. I am not a human being, but a spirit and a demon from the hottest hell. I am what you Orleanians and your foolish police call the Axman of Notre Dame. When I see fit, I shall come and claim other victims. I alone know who they'll be. I shall leave no clue except my bloody axe be smeared with blood and brains of he whom I have sent below to keep me company. If you wish, you may tell the police to be careful and not to rustle my jimmies. Of course, I am a reasonable spirit. I take no offense at the way they have conducted their investigations in the past. In fact, they have been so utterly stupid as to not only amuse me, but His Satanic Majesty Franz Joseph, etc. But tell them to beware. Let them not try to discover what I am, for it were better that they were never born than to incur the wrath of the great Axman. I don't think there is any need of such a warning, for I feel sure the police will always dodge me, as they have in the past. They are wise and know how to keep away from all harm. Undoubtedly, you Orleanians think of me as a most horrible murderer, which I am. But I could be much worse if I wanted to. Trust me, bucko. If I wished, I could pay a visit to your city every night. At will, I could slay thousands of your best citizens, and the worst, for I am in close relationship with the Angel of Death herself. Now, to be exact, at 12:15 earthly time, on next Tuesday night, I'm going to pass over New Orleans. In my infinite mercy, I'm going to make a little proposition to you people. Here it is. I'm very fond of jazz music, and I swear by all the devils in my nether regions that every person shall be spared in whose home a jazz band is in full swing at the time I have just mentioned. If everyone has a jazz band going, well, then, so much the better for you people. One thing is certain, that is that some of your people who do not jazz it out on that specific Tuesday night, if there be any, will get the axe. My axe. Well, as I am cold and crave the warmth of my native Tartarus, and it is about time I leave your earthly home, I will cease my discourse. Hoping that thou wilt publish this, that it may go well with thee, I have been, am, and will be the worst spirit that ever existed, either in fact or the realm of fantasy. Deuces, the Axman.
Examination of the note in present-day terms would most certainly have been discounted. Although serial killers seek to inject themselves into the investigation and draw attention to their outwitting of the police, this letter gave no details of the crimes which only the killer could have been aware. Secondly, it would appear that the supernatural being referring to himself as, quote, the Axman, end quote, is following in the footsteps of a bloody mentor, Jack the Ripper. The former not only wrote letters to the press about his crimes and taunted the police, but also allegedly left a mysterious message after his fourth murder that, even to this day, historians argue as to its meaning. This leaves the Mrs. Tony message scrawled on the sidewalk not too far from the Maggio murder scene, to leave investigators and historians alike to ponder the demented ramblings of a psychopath. In demanding that the city's inhabitants fill the air with jazz music on the night of the killer's choosing, a city gripped in fear hoped to appease the murderer. A further effort to make sure that the killer would pass over the residents playing his favorite music, John Joseph Davila wrote a special ditty entitled The Mysterious Axman's Jazz, or Papa Don't Scare Me. Other musicians reviewed the piece with comical criticism as the playful piece was composed during the bloody aspects of the crimes being committed. Exactly as the Axman demanded, every home played jazz music on March 19, 1919, in the hopes that the demon would not visit their home that night. The Times-Picayune printed a cartoon lampooning the night of jazz. While the family sat around the piano and made merry, a young mother can be seen at the window casting watch over her family. The danger was real, and the people of New Orleans took the threat with the phantom seriously. The city experienced a temporary reprieve from the murders. That reprieve only lasted until the end of the summer that year. On August 3, 1919, Sarah Lauman, a young, vivacious 19-year-old girl, felt a paralyzing boom on her head as she slept. When she awoke, she suffered a gaping wound in her head and managed to scare off her intruder. The assailant attempted to make his way into the Lauman residence through a window and not through a panel in the door. Miss Lauman recovered from her wounds. At approximately 1:45 a.m. on October 27, 1919, the Axman claimed his alleged last victim. Jefferson Parish Deputy Ben Corcoran was walking home after a long shift at the station when 11-year-old Rosie Pepitone ran into the middle of the street and began screaming that her father had been attacked. Deputy Corcoran asked the little girl to show him where she lived, and when the two arrived at the Pepitone residence, Deputy Corcoran spoke with Esther Pepitone, the victim's wife. Mrs. Pepitone went into the bedroom, followed by the deputy. Corcoran examined Mike Pepitone as he lay on the bed bleeding profusely from a gaping wound in his head. Mrs. Pepitone then said to the police officer, quote, "It looks like the Axman was here and murdered Mike," end quote. An ambulance soon arrived and rushed the bleeding man to the charity hospital. Mike Pepitone later succumbed to his wounds. Instead of the assailant using an axe, this time he used an iron bar with a bolt at the end of it. Other than the utterances of his wife, the police could find no connection between the Pepitone attack and that of the Axeman's previous victims. After an intense investigation, police surmised that the attack on Mike Pepitone may have been a revenge killing stemming from his father's association with organized crime a few years earlier. In 1910, Mike's father, Pietro Pepitone, shot and killed a rival grocer by the name of Charles Di Cristina. The elder Pepitone stood trial and was convicted of murder and sentenced to 20 years in prison. Peter Pepitone later received a pardon and released from Angola State Penitentiary. It may have been a revenge killing for the death of Di Cristina, but why wait 10 years to carry out a vendetta? After the attack on the Pepitones, the city of New Orleans breathed a sigh of relief and almost forgot the horrors brought on to the population by the killer. That is until a newspaper article appeared stating that the mystery of the Axman had been solved. In 1921, newspaper headlines from Los Angeles, California stated that a Mrs. Esther Albano had shot a man by the name of Joseph Mumphrey, who had entered her home uninvited. Mrs. Albano declared that the man demanded money from her and threatened both her and her children if the money were not forthcoming. Police later identified Mrs. Albano as Mrs. Mike Pepitone, the wife of the last alleged victim of the Axeman, Mike Pepitone. After the death of her husband, Mrs. Pepitone traveled to California to attend her niece's wedding. While there, she met a man named Angelo Albano, whom she married a short time later. On October 27, 1921, Esther Albano reported her husband missing. Alerted relatives in New Orleans traveled to Los Angeles to help with the search. Allegedly, the man calling himself Joseph Mumphrey repeatedly threatened to kill Angelo Albano if some money were not paid. On one particular night, Mumphrey visited the Albano residence and demanded the money. When he leveled threats to Mrs. Albano, she did what she had to do to protect her family. After her arrest and subsequent trial, Esther Albano was acquitted of all charges. In all, the Axeman claimed 8 victims, injuring somewhere between 6 and 10 people. Joseph Mumphrey has been forwarded as the main suspect in this case, but prison records from that time period reflect that Mumphrey had been imprisoned since 1908 and did not secure his release until 1923. So, who was the Axeman? Again, we may never know unless there is an eyewitness account that we have never heard of, or a police report where the detectives made some sort of assumption. Still, it does send chills down your spine when you realize this man, if he was a man, was never apprehended.
If you enjoyed our presentation of true crime, please like, subscribe, and hit the bell to receive notifications on any future programs. Welcome to the True Crime Man's Dark Imagination YouTube channel, your one destination for the most factual, engrossing, and intelligent profiles of historical crime on the internet. Please like, subscribe, and hit the bell so that you will not miss any further notifications of upcoming episodes. And tell your friends about us.
Cults have taken on an ominous aura within American and world culture. The mystical and charismatic power that cult leaders exert over their followers creates a morose atmosphere of darkness, tragedy, and death. The disciples relish in the misinterpretation of Bible verse of their leaders, becoming brainwashed into executing the whims of those leaders. A series of horrifying events occurred in southwestern Louisiana in the beginning of the 20th century that accelerated rumors of a single madman murdering whole families. In actuality, the murders in southwestern Louisiana in 1911 went undiscovered for a long time. But one thing was for certain. The Church of Sacrifice created havoc amongst the black population of southwestern Louisiana and eastern Texas, creating a legend that has endured for over 100 years. On February 11, 1911, in Crowley, Louisiana, just west of Lafayette, authorities found the bodies of Walter J. Byers, his wife, and their young child murdered in their home. Investigators surmised that the perpetrator of the crime entered the residence of the decedents through the rear window of the abode. The Byers residence stood in one of the poorest sections of town where black families congregated, and where those who lived there any length of time had grown accustomed to the violence that frequently occurred there. Upon closer examination of the bodies, investigators surmised that the Byers family, quote, had been brained with an axe, end quote. Police commented at the ferocity of such a crime as this one. But this brought to the forefront a killer of such daring that local authorities never dreamed this series would grow increasingly more volatile. Almost 2 weeks later, on the morning of February 24, 1911, in Lafayette, Louisiana proper, Nina Martin sat at the kitchen table of her house, having just been awakened by the crow of the morning rooster. At approximately 7 a.m. that morning, Nina's son, Lazimi Felix, burst open the door to the front of the shack, ran in, obviously out of breath, stating that her sister and brother-in-law had just been brutally murdered. Nina then went to his sister's cabin, and when she opened the door, she discovered a scene of almost indescribable gore. Alexander Andrus, his wife, Mimi, and their 2 children, Joachim and Agnes, lay dead in one bed with a bloody axe on the floor near the foot of the bed. Upon further examination of the dead bodies, the coroner of Lafayette Parish stated that the family of 4 was slaughtered, quote, at the hands of a party or parties unknown, end quote. On March 22, 1911, near Beaumont, Texas, Louis Cassaway, his wife, and their 3 children suffered the exact same injuries as the Andruses. Their bodies were badly beaten and their skulls crushed with an axe. There was one exception. Where the victims in Louisiana were all black, Cassaway's wife was white. Authorities in Beaumont believed that the killer did not agree with the mixed couples and killed the entire family as a result of that anger. After hearing about the Cassaway murders, Lafayette Parish Sheriff Louis Lacoste took more of a personal interest in the murders that occurred closer to home and developed his own theory of the crimes. Sheriff Lacoste believed that the killer to be a man of some local criminal renown by the name of Raymond Barnabet, a middle-aged black man who lived in the area. Sheriff Lacoste went to the Barnabet residence and immediately arrested Raymond for the Byers and Andruses murders. The chief lawman also believed that Barnabet was responsible for the Cassaway murders as well. But unfortunately, Sheriff Lacoste lacked the evidence to even hold Barnabet, so he released him. But a few days later, Sheriff Lacoste returned to the Barnabet residence and re-arrested Raymond Barnabet. In October of that year, a grand jury indicted Barnabet for the Byers and Andrus' murders. On October 19, 1911, Raymond Barnabet stood trial for murder. During the course of the preliminary investigations for the prosecution, questioning of the defendant produced leads that otherwise would have eluded authorities. Testifying for the prosecution, Nina Porter, Barnabet's common-law wife, and his two children, Zephyrin and Clementine, took the stand. Nina Porter testified that Raymond Barnabet left their home and boarded a train on the night of the murders around 7 p.m., stating that he traveled to Broussard, Louisiana, just a short little trip from their residence, and, quote, jumped, end quote, a train heading that way. According to Porter, Barnabet wore a blue shirt or jumper. He did not arrive back home until 2 a.m. the next morning, and Barnabet became angry when he discovered that Porter saved him no dinner. Barnabet got more agitated when he learned that he lost his smoking pipe during the trip. Without food and his favorite pipe, Barnabet went to sleep. When his 17-year-old daughter, Clementine, took the stand, she gave a much different version of the story about what happened the night of the Andrus murders. Clementine testified that her father returned home much later than Porter stated. The daughter stated that her father did not return home until closer to sunrise of the next morning. Upon his return, Barnabet, according to his daughter, wore the same shirt in which he left the house the evening before. When he arrived the next morning, Clementine stated that Raymond Barnabet walked all over the house smoking the very pipe that he claimed he lost the night before. His clothes appeared to be covered in blood and brain matter, and Clementine stated that she washed the clothes to get out the stains. Clementine also stated that her father demanded his dinner because he just murdered a whole family and threatened Zephyrin, his son, and Clementine that if they mentioned a word as to what happened, he would kill them. When son Zephyrin testified, he stated that he witnessed his father enter the home with an undershirt and a pair of trousers with a lot of blood and brain matter attached to it. Zephyrin testified that his father demanded that he retrieve his dinner and yelled at the young man that he, quote, killed the whole damn Andrus family, end quote. After making that statement in front of the court, he turned to the judge and strongly suggested that the judge find a way to keep his father behind bars, quote, due to his violent and threatening behavior at the time of the murder and in the past, end quote. The prosecution called the whole of the Stevens family, neighbors of the Barnabets, to testify in court. In an effort to prevent an attack on the Stevens' credibility, a local newspaper stated that the prosecution put into the record that the Stevens family were, quote, representatives of the best of their race, were clean, modest, direct, and uncontradictory, end quote. The Barnabets, specifically Zephyrin and Clementine, had been characterized by local law enforcement as, quote, filthy, shifty, degenerate examples of the lowest African type, end quote. Sheriff Lacoste, for one, believed the siblings knew more about the murders than they led law enforcement to believe. After a very short trial, a jury of all whites convicted Raymond Barnabet of the murders of the Andrus and Byers families. This conviction stood, at least for the time being, as a result of Zephyrin and Clementine's testimony. But still, police questioned the motives of the siblings in presenting such damning evidence against their father. The defense filed a motion for a new trial and claimed that Raymond Barnabet was drunk during the proceedings, therefore not competent in helping his counsel demonstrate a proper defense. That the jury failed to follow the judge's instructions at deliberation, and that the prosecution failed to introduce a motive for the murders. The appellate court agreed and granted Raymond Barnabet a new trial. While Barnabet waited in the Lafayette jail for his second day in court, on the morning of November 27, 1911, again in Lafayette, Louisiana, police discovered the bodies of Norbert Randall, his wife, Azima, and their 4 children, Renee Randall, aged 6, Norbert Jr., aged 5, Agnes Randall, aged 2, and Albert Seiss, aged 8, in their small cabin on Lafayette Street, all of them lying on 2 beds in the same room, quote, fearfully mutilated, end quote. When Sheriff Lacoste arrived at the scene, he noticed an axe leaning against a wall near the foot of the bed, which the killer obviously washed of all blood. Later information came to light that Norbert Randall, in addition to suffering other injuries, also sustained a gunshot wound to the head. Because of the scenes in the Byers, Andrus, and Randall murders, and the number of victims left behind, investigators theorized that more than one killer must have been involved. And although the murders took place at different locations, the police suspected that all of these murders, somehow, were connected. Later in the day of the Randall murders, acting on a hunch, Sheriff Lacoste located Clementine Barnabet at a friend's house, and after using the restroom, Sheriff Lacoste passed a dress on the way to the living room that appeared to have been stained with blood and brain matter. The lawman immediately arrested the teenager and charged her with murder. Police also arrested her brother, Zephyrin, as an accessory to the crimes, along with 2 other men, Edwin Charles and Gregory Porter. When detectives began their interrogation of Clementine, she laughed uncontrollably, as if she sought to demonstrate a mental defect, but then she stated she had nothing to do with the murders. Authorities continued believing that Clementine knew more than she professed to the interrogators and held her for more questioning. Zephyrin maintained he had an alibi for the nights in question, but until investigators could positively confirm his whereabouts, he remained in Lafayette Jail along with Edwin Charles and Gregory Porter. In order to establish a more solid connection to the murders, Sheriff Lacoste sent Clementine's clothing to a chemist in New Orleans. Granted, the only thing, at that time, and at that particular stage of forensics, a chemist would be able to do is to establish whether the blood contained on the clothing was human or animal. Even though Sheriff Lacoste may have been able to convince Clementine that her clothes contained blood from the 3 series of murders as a ruse, the fact remained that the forensic tests would not be able to reveal the identity of the person or persons murdered. Even with the knowledge that the clothing was sent to a chemist, Clementine sat during her long interrogations with deputies and Sheriff Lacoste maintaining, quote, a sphinx-like attitude, end quote. Several people stated that Clementine wandered the streets at night and was nowhere near the scene of the murders. Still, Clementine offered no explanation as to how the blood smeared her clothing. One of the theories of the crime placed Clementine at the scene of the Randall murder after having picked up an axe on the way to the family's residence. Clementine allegedly attacked Norbert Randall first, instantly killing him, then attacking Azima Randall, also killing her instantly. Then she went after the children. The coroner later confirmed that Norbert Randall had been shot in the head post-mortem, but authorities failed to find the pistol. Investigators, although they believed Clementine Barnabet played an essential part in the murders of all the families, they still postulated that she could not have committed the murders alone, nor could law enforcement figure out the motive to wipe out 3 whole families, 4 if the Cassaways were included. As the investigation matured, detectives dug deeper into Clementine's past and determined, after reconsidering the crime scenes as a whole, that the murders looked convincingly like they were religiously inspired. Because they believed Clementine to be the principal perpetrator, Sheriff Lacoste ordered the release of Zephyrin, Edwin Charles, and Gregory Porter. Clementine and Raymond still sat in the Lafayette jail. Sheriff Lacoste subsequently discovered that a cult existed within his parish. This revelation came to light when investigators learned that the victims belonged to a fringe church known as the, quote, Church of Sacrifice, end quote, under the tutelage of Reverend King Harris, where church members were, quote, so intensely moved and impressed by the teaching of the Testament, sacrificial ideas, and ceremonies that they were incited to commit heinous crimes, end quote. Although Sheriff Lacoste strongly believed the 2 responsible for the rash of murders occurring in Louisiana and Texas were secured tightly within his jail, on January 18, 1912, in the town of Crowley, in an area known to locals as the, quote, Promised Land, end quote, Harriet Crane looked across the street from her residence to a house occupied by her daughter, Marie Warner. Crane noticed that even at this late time of the day, It was approximately noon. She saw no activity whatsoever at the house. Marie Warner had 3 small children, and Crane thought this very bizarre indeed. When Crane stepped outside of her residence, she saw one of her close neighbors, Dorney Birdsong, and asked him if he had seen either Warner or the children. Crane and Birdsong then walked across the street to the Warner residence to check for any signs of activity. The pair walked around the back of the residence, and too frightened to go in, they stopped another neighbor, Ben Robinson, to go inside and see if the family had awakened. With much hesitation, Robinson finally entered the Warner shack and discovered, quote, the mangled remains of 4 occupants on a bed in the front room, end quote. In addition to Marie Warner, her 3 children, Pearl, aged 9, Gary, aged 7, and Harriet, aged 2. The police arrived quickly after being summoned to the residence. When they examined the crime scene more closely, they discovered a blood-stained axe in the same room with the victims, and also discovered 2 sets of foot tracks in the mud, as it had rained the night before. At first, police utilized the bloodhounds to track the killers, but later called off the search when the dogs lost the scent. 3 days later, on January 21, 1912, in a residence located at 331 Rock Street in Lake Charles, Louisiana, authorities discovered the bodies of Felix Broussard, quote, an industrious man who was without enemies, end quote, his wife, and their 3 children, all under the age of 8, and all had their skulls crushed and mangled by the axe blows. Investigators found the murder weapon underneath the adult's bed. The perpetrators gained entrance to the residence through the kitchen window, but this time, the killer, or killers, left more clues as to their identities. On the front door of the residence, there appeared a Bible transcription written in blood that read, when he maketh the acquisition for blood, he forgetteth not the cry of the humble. Next to the inscription, also scrawled in blood, read, quote, Human 5, end quote. To add to the bloodthirsty signature of the killer or killers, police also found a bucket under the bed of the children placed there, obviously, to catch the blood as it ran from their wounds. Immediately after the Broussard murders, in an attempt to ascertain the operations of this supposed cult, Sheriff Lacoste arrested Reverend King Harris and brought him to the jail for questioning. The lawman did this not only for the suspect's protection, but also to delve into the mysterious teaching that would cause followers to murder others in the name of God. Even though Clementine and Zephyrin sat in the Lafayette jail, Sheriff Lacoste believed that other followers perpetuated the mantra of the cult and continued their bloody work. Reverend Harris cooperated fully with Sheriff Lacoste and stated that the Church of Sacrifice was an unofficial sect of the Christ-sanctified Holy Church located in Lake Charles, Louisiana. Nothing in what has been sermonized within his church would condone, nor would there be any messages causing the followers to commit the crimes that had been committed in the most recent months. Another preacher suffered the interrogations of Sheriff Lacoste as well. But the dutiful sheriff failed to retrieve any more useful information out of the most recent suspect. Both men walked out of the jail shaken, but free. After all the crimes that had been committed, Sheriff Lacoste faced a frightened and angered population. The black populations of Crowley, Rayne, Lafayette, and Lake Charles looked to the sheriff for protection and whether they have gotten any closer to catching the mysterious killer or killers. One of the residents, a black businessman known as Deshotel, received what could only be called a, quote, black hand letter, end quote. This was a well-known missive used by the mafia to extort money from a chosen victim. Deshotel's letter stated, "Eat well and drink well, in preparation for the death which will overtake him." This message was allegedly written in blood. Although the threat failed to materialize, a wholesale panic ensued within the black populations of the region. The black citizens of Breaux Bridge, Louisiana, a small farming community located just east of Lafayette, acted fearful that the axe murderer may visit them in the middle of the night. The entire black population of Breaux Bridge stayed awake at night with loaded weapons, waiting for the axe fiend to appear. No one knew who was next. On February 11, 1912, blacks in the region decided to take matters into their own hands. 150 of them met at the Good Hope Baptist Church in Lafayette. There, all those present stated that they would, quote, render all assistance in our possession to authorities and officers of our city in bringing to justice the perpetrators of these crimes, end quote. The group further resolved to supply any and all information necessary to apprehend those responsible, as well as act in the capacity as law enforcement officers in certain situations. What was more important, the group gave thanks to the white population of Lafayette for their, quote, guidance and support, end quote. Increased patrols around the region by several law enforcement departments had a calming effect on the population. The involvement of other departments and local witnesses seemed to allay fears of those residents in the region. Authorities could only hope that members of this cult would discontinue the series of murders with their two leaders sitting behind bars. Although the patrols may have deterred any followers of the, quote, Church of Sacrifice, end quote, from committing murders in southwestern Louisiana, it seemed that some followers in Texas refused to relent. On February 20th, 1912, 9 days after the community meeting, at a residence located at 1428 Cable Street in the north end of Beaumont, Texas, police discovered the bodies of Hattie Dove, 26, Ernie Dove, 14, Ethel Dove, 16, and Jamie Quirk. The bodies displayed signs of the previous murders, and police held no doubt that the same person or persons were responsible for the rampage. Somehow, the police believed, Clementine and her father provided guidance to her followers as to whom to murder and where. Sheriff Lacoste received a letter that gave some indication as to how the murders still continued even though the leaders sat in jail. It appeared that one leader in the Church of Sacrifice, possibly a lieutenant of the Barnabets, went through the region choosing victims. When Sheriff Lacoste first arrested Clementine, she denied any knowledge surrounding the murders that had been committed at that time. But 2 weeks after the Dove murders, Clementine surprised everyone when she made a wholesale confession to being responsible for the murders and shared, quote, insights with authorities regarding how she came to participate in such a murderous lifestyle, end quote. Clementine also related to Sheriff Lacoste where she was born and how she came into a life of what she called, quote, degradation, end quote. Clementine also related how she became involved with voodoo. Louisiana had long been infamous for the ritualistic practices of this religion, but Clementine Barnabet believed that the ancient practices could help her accomplish more sinister objectives. On a visit to New Iberia, Clementine, along with 2 other women and 2 men, met an old black woman that showed them the way of, quote, hoodoo, end quote, and bought some, quote, conja bags, end quote, from the conjurer. Conja bags were said to be small sacks that contained herbs and animal parts for various spells. Clementine claimed that the old woman claimed that the conja bags would protect Clementine and her accomplices from discovery by the police should they desire to commit a crime. Clementine sought to test the old woman's claim by traveling to Rayne, Louisiana, dressed as a man. She stole an axe from an unknown person and proceeded to commit her first murder. In her lengthy confession, Clementine stated,
I saw the mother sleeping on the bed. Then I decided I would enter the house and there begin the work which we had planned. On entering the house, I struck the woman on the right temple and killed her instantly. One of the children was awakened by the noise, and before he could raise his head from the pillow, I struck a blow somewhere near the left ear. Then I struck the other 2. I left the man's clothes, which I wore in the house, and left in the women's clothes. Returned to my sister's house, and later during the same night, I boarded a train for Lafayette, arriving here about midnight.
During the rest of her confession, Clementine stated that she used a gun only once when she murdered Norbert Randall and recalled every grisly detail of her murders in front of the investigators. The confessed murderer said that the gender of her victims was of no import. Authorities believe that even though others may have executed their crimes, Raymond, Clementine, and Zephyrin, later rearrested, vicariously led the killers to their prey. Clementine claimed she killed the children so that they would not be orphans. In testifying against her father, Clementine claimed she just wanted to continue her work, and her brother suggested that she testify. At the time, Clementine maintained that she, and she alone, was responsible for the murders. Lafayette Parish District Attorney Howard E. Bruner formulated a theory where he believed that the Texas murders were committed, though a copycat killer rather than any of the members of the church sacrifice were responsible. Bruner characterized Clementine as, quote, a moral pervert, and gave her little credit for her attempts to involve another and probably mythical person, end quote. The story of a teenage girl traveled all over the country and made headlines all over the world. What some people could not fathom was how did a teenage girl with no education conduct a series of murders committed by either herself or her followers without being detected. Succinctly, citizens following the story displayed disbelief that someone so young could be that diabolical. But Sheriff Lacoste, listening to Clementine's confession, deemed the mystical fanaticism angle to the murders as impossible and, quote, placed no credence in Clementine's hoodoo version and many other of her illusory flights of imagination in giving her confession, end quote. On April 4, 1912, D.A. Bruner filed charges against Clementine Barnabet for the murders of the Randall family. Newspapers attributed more than 35 murders to the young murderess, but still unproven. Sheriff Lacoste, in the meantime, traveled to New Iberia and arrested Joseph Thibodeau, the man who allegedly constructed the ganja bags. Thibodeau was not an, quote, old woman, end quote, as Clementine first confessed. Clementine later identified Thibodeau as the man who sold her and her party the ganja bags when deputies at the Lafayette jail brought him to her cell. Another lawman, a Crowley, Louisiana Sheriff Fontenot, remained skeptical of Clementine's guilt as he cited her confessions and the many inconsistencies that came to light. Sheriff Fontenot did not consider her to be a viable suspect. While the investigators pursued further leads, another murder occurred outside of the jurisdiction of Louisiana law enforcement, but carried some of the same signatures of the Louisiana murders. On April 12, 1912, authorities discovered the mutilated bodies of William Barton, his wife, their 2 children, and Barton's brother-in-law, Leon Avers. Investigators determined that these murders were not the result of a copycat. The crime scene closely resembled those of the Louisiana murders, with one addition that law enforcement did not mention for fear of generating further panic. Like the Louisiana murders, the children murdered each had their fingers separated on their hands with small pegs of wood. The meaning of this particular facet never became clear, but for the killer or killers to take the time to meticulously place pegs between the children's fingers, this left no doubt that the same killer or killers were responsible for the Randall murders as well as the ones committed in Louisiana. With all of the publicity and the wearing down of Zephyrin and Raymond Barnabet, Zephyrin confessed that he and his father murdered the Andrus family with Clementine and 2 men, Ute and Darman Thomas, and 1 woman who assisted as an accessory. Sheriff Lacoste arrested these suspects as well. As law enforcement tried to gather more evidence in preparing for the trials of the Barnabets, it appeared the followers of the Church of Sacrifice continued their bloody, quote, work, end quote. On August 20th, 1912, the assailant entered the Dashleel family home through a kitchen window and attacked Mrs. Dashleel first, striking her in the area of her head, or so he thought. Mrs. Dashleel raised her arm to block the blow. When the assailant tried a second time, the axe fell on her right foot, causing a superficial wound. Her screams alerted neighbors, who then called the police. Sales of pistols continued to soar, and stores soon ran out of ammunition for various firearms. Black citizens, although they appeared to be the most prepared for attacks, took little solace that Clementine, Zephyrin, and Raymond would face trial soon. On October 16, 1912, Clementine's attorneys moved before the court to have their client examined by psychiatrists, citing her behavior at the time of her arrest, the merciless and unfeeling way she acted in front of Sheriff Lacoste. Defense attorneys had reason to believe that Clementine exhibited signs of insanity and, as is the job of defense attorneys. They zealously fought for psychiatric examinations, and she not be brought to trial herein until the question of her mental condition and her consequent moral and legal accountability or non-accountability for her acts and her statements. Subsequently, 3 psychiatrists from New Orleans examined the teen and determined that Clementine, although she may be, quote, morally deprived, usually ignorant, and of low-grade mentality, end quote, was not insane as per the insanity protocols of the day. As the trial commenced from the alienist's findings, the prosecution admitted Clementine's confession and all the evidence that pointed to her guilt, especially in the Randall murders. On the following day, after a brief deliberation, the jury found Clementine Barnabet guilty of murder and sentenced her to life in the state penitentiary in Angola, Louisiana. Although those paying close attention to the case cast no doubts that the teen would receive the death penalty, because of her age, 17, the jury recommended life imprisonment and the judge complied, with the supposed leader of the Church of Sacrifice sentenced to prison for the rest of her life. On November 22, 1912, in the small Mississippi town of Philadelphia, 100 miles northeast of Jackson, authorities discovered the bodies of William Walmsley, his wife, and their 4-year-old child, murdered with an axe. The family proved to have once been members of the Church of Sacrifice and left some time before the murders began. Police were left with no clues to the identities of the killer or killers. As the new year of 1913 approached, the murders seemed to cease. Historical sources are not clear as to whether the accomplices to these series of murders ever stood trial or conviction. Zephyrin and Raymond Barnabet were released from jail and never really heard from again. After Clementine began her incarceration, prison officials assigned her as a cane cutter in the fields surrounding the prison. In 1913, Clementine attempted to escape, but prison officials captured her not too long after that. In 1923, Clementine left the prison, never to be seen or heard from again. The question remains for historians and criminologists alike. How did someone who committed such heinous murders manage to only serve 10 years for her crimes? The answer lies in the Louisiana legislature. In 1902, they passed an act that allowed for the commutation or the diminishing of life sentences if the individual requesting that particular relief could demonstrate he or she had abided by the rules of the prison system and deserved clemency. With the exception of the attempted escape just after her arrival to the prison, Clementine became a model prisoner. The legend of Clementine Barnabet, like other legends, grew in popularity. Even though her fate has not been documented, Clementine's presence in history did not resurface until an obscure blog mentioned her name in a story that was submitted by someone named, quote, Voodoo Gal 11, end quote, sometime in 2010. This young lady claimed that she went to visit her great-grandmother for her 100th birthday. The young lady sat and listened to her great-grandmother as she remembered the story of Clementine Barnabet, taking in every detail as if the centenarian were actually a witness to the crimes at the times they occurred. The great-grandmother pointed to a merciless detail that some history books seem to have left out, that Clementine used to beat her suitors with a whip, and if they could withstand the beating, she would allow the courtship to continue. Unfortunately, it seemed that several of the anxious young men gave up any fondness for the teenager after they learned the conditions of the mistreatment. The great-grandmother related the story with all calmness and matter-of-factness, sipping her iced tea when she continued to add details. Later that year, Voodoo Gal 11 received news that her great-grandmother passed away. She traveled to southwestern Louisiana for the funeral. There she met her aunt and asked if she could see a photo of her great-grandmother as a young woman. In the words of the storyteller, upon viewing the likeness,
"She had alabaster skin, long curly black hair, and very light eyes, and then I started trembling."
the storyteller then realized that in viewing the photograph in front of her, chillingly, that her great-grandmother was, in fact, Clementine Barnabet. Although Voodoo Gal 11 merely presented the story without any proof whatsoever, it gave the reader Something to think about. If we take into account the story related by Voodoo Gal 11, then we must accept that her great-grandmother was only 2 years old at the time of the murders, as in 2010, the relatives celebrated the 100th birthday of the great-grandmother. A virtual impossibility that a toddler carried out the murders for which Clementine Barnabet stood accused, convicted, and sentenced. Over the last few years, conspiracy theories have abounded that the murders allegedly to have been committed by Clementine Barnabet were part of a larger series of killings perpetrated by one crazed Axman. As an experienced legal investigator and historian, this conspiracy theory can be easily discounted. Other murders committed in other regions of the country have different signatures. This is something that the murder or murderers leave behind, where they are utilized to identify the type of individual who could endeavor to destroy human lives. The series of homicides committed by members of the Church of Sacrifice were religious in connotation, not just the wholesale annihilation of families because of a deep-seated psychopathy. In one particular presentation, I watched a documentary filmmaker attempt, rather tenuously, to attach every murder, axe murder, that occurred from 1879 Georgia to 20th century New Orleans to one killer. If that were the case, by the end of his spree, the killer would have been anywhere between 79 and 102 years old. Until next time.
If you enjoyed our presentation of true crime, please like, subscribe, and hit the bell to receive notifications on any further programs.
What motivates a child to commit the ultimate act of murder? Is it the results of a cruel and sometimes demeaning upbringing? Or is it simply a fascination with seeing others suffer in excruciating agony? With the profile that we present here, it serves as a prime example of an abhorrent fantasy run amok, culminating in the deaths of children and the incarceration of what can only be considered a human monster. Born on November 19, 1859, the second son to Charles and Ruth Pomeroy, Jesse Harding Pomeroy grew up in one of the worst slums in South Boston. Jesse's father was a known alcoholic who had a mean temper with drink. In one of these states of drunkenness, Charles used a horsewhip on young Jesse because the youth committed truancy. Often Charles Pomeroy would bring his children behind the outhouse for beatings so severe that they would bleed. More times than not, Charles stripped the children naked before beating them, causing, perhaps, Jesse to associate the beatings with sexual satisfaction along with pain and punishment. The Pomeroy household seemed to lack pets due to the fact that bizarre and violent things would happen to them. Ruth Pomeroy wanted to have a set of lovebirds in the house, but remembered the last birds that entered the Pomeroy household would wind up with their heads being twisted off. Furthermore, young Jesse was discovered torturing the neighbor's cat. Thereafter, Ruth Pomeroy would not allow animals in the house. Like many other killers over time, the torturing of animals became blasé to young Jesse. He soon began looking to try his torture skills with humans. Being a big child for his age, Jesse looked for victims that were less than his stature, figuring they would be easier to subdue. His first known victim was a young boy named William Payne. On Christmas Day 1871, two men working their way through the snow near a cabin on Powderhorn Hill, Chelsea in Boston, recounted, When we approached the cabin, we heard a whimpering cry. The sounds then grew louder and clearer. When we opened the door, we saw a little boy, no older than perhaps 4 years old, hanging by his wrists from the center beam of the outhouse. He appeared very pale, as the weather was pretty harsh that winter. His lips were blue. His hands looked purple due to the blood trapped by the bindings. The skin on the rest of his body appeared shockingly white. When the two men cut the young boy down from his bindings, they noticed the massive welts on his back. Immediately, they knew the brutality with which he suffered that day. Billy Payne could not identify his attacker, and the police marked the incident as isolated. In February of 1872, Tracy Hayden, age 7, was enticed by Pomeroy to accompany him to Powderhorn Hill to, quote, see the soldiers, end quote. Once Pomeroy isolated the young boy, he beat him mercilessly, knocking out the child's front teeth and blackening his eyes, before stripping him of his clothes, torturing the helpless boy as he did young Billy Payne, and threatening to cut off his genitals. Again, Hayden could not identify his attacker. Now, all the police knew was that there was a deviant on their hands and they must act fast to capture whomever it may be. In the early spring of 1872, Pomeroy struck again when he promised 8-year-old Robert Mayer he would take him to see the Barnum Circus. Once Pomeroy reached his favorite torture spot, he leapt upon the young Mayer, subduing him, stripping off his clothing, and beating him with a stick. Mayer noticed that Pomeroy pleasured himself with the swing of the switch that tore into the flesh of the young boy's body. Furthermore, and even more strangely, Pomeroy had Mayer recite swear words the whole time he administered the beating. Allegedly, at about the time that Pomeroy achieved orgasm, he freed the young Mayer and threatened that he would kill the youth if he spoke a word of the incident to anyone. By this time, the parents in and around Boston became enraged at law enforcement that they were unable to locate this fiend abducting, beating, and humiliating young children. In a dragnet to bring in all, quote, brown-haired young boys, end quote, as described by the victims, the police failed to find the youth responsible for the terror. The newspapers of the day branded Pomeroy the, quote, inhuman scamp, end quote, and touted the young pervert as a bogeyman that scoured the back streets and wildernesses surrounding South Boston in search of victims. The police mistakenly issued a new description of the monster as having red hair with a red beard, when in actuality, Pomeroy had been described as a smooth-skinned young boy with the complexion matching more of a young female. In July of 1872, Pomeroy attacked again. This time his victim was a 7-year-old boy. Pomeroy kept with his signature and again stripped the boy naked, beat him, and then achieved some height of sexual pleasure from watching the young child writhe in pain. Pomeroy left the young boy with the usual threats and escaped into the nearby woods. The Boston Globe opined that, quote, it is a good thing for the inhuman scamp that his identity is unknown just now, end quote. After this editorial appeared, and quite by coincidence, Ruth Pomeroy decided to move the family from Chelsea to South Boston. Whether it be for economic reasons or not, Mrs. Pomeroy decided a change necessary for her and the children. Historians have estimated that she must have known that her son may have been involved with the recent rash of attacks, but she remained fatally loyal to her son and never once believed he could have been responsible for the attacks that paralyzed the parents with fear in the area. A young, sickly 7-year-old boy wandered along the South Boston shoreline, as young boys will do, trying to discover some buried treasure or some lost artifact that would make him rich and famous. George Pratt, during his search, ran into a boy, Pomeroy, slightly older than he, who offered him 25 cents if he would help the older boy with an errand. Little George accepted the offer and went off with Pomeroy, never suspecting that this generous youth meant him any harm. When George and the older boy arrived at a secluded place, Pomeroy subdued George, stripped him naked, tied him up, and began torturing him. However, the attack took on a more brutal facet as the attacker bit George's cheek, extracting a large portion of flesh as he did so. Then the attacker, over George's painful cries, clawed viciously at the young boy's skin with his own fingernails. Then, when he thought the young boy could take no more, Pomeroy brandished a sewing needle and stabbed deeply into George's flesh. Pomeroy hoped to obtain a little more pain within the youth when he attempted to stab the boy in the eye with the needle. George managed to roll over on his stomach and prevented any further injury. Thus, Pomeroy fled, leaving little George tied up in the small wooden structure. But before leaving, Pomeroy bit deeply into the young boy's flesh, tearing a piece of his buttocks away from the victim's body. Approximately a month after the George Pratt assault, Pomeroy wrangled another victim, and it became obvious that his intentions became more depraved. He lured a 6-year-old boy named Harry Austin to another secluded spot, and just like his previous victims, stripped the boy down. But this time, Pomeroy's points of torture became more concentrated. Instead of a needle, Pomeroy pulled out a knife and viciously stabbed young Harry in the armpits and between the shoulder blades. At just that moment, Pomeroy attempted to excise Harry's private parts, but something startled him and he fled the scene. It appeared that Pomeroy's attacks escalated in their cruelty and regularity, as in under a week, Pomeroy was on the hunt again. This time, he lured a 7-year-old named Joseph Kennedy to the marshes near the bay. Pomeroy beat the young boy within an inch of his life, then demanded that Kennedy kneel and recite the Lord's Prayer. Not just the Lord's Prayer, but a parody with pornographic language. Kennedy refused, and Pomeroy first cut Kennedy across the face, then dragged the boy to the bay where he washed out his wounds with salt water. Pomeroy then fled. Less than a week after the Kennedy attack, Robert Gould, 5 years old, was discovered lashed to a post near the railroad tracks near South Boston. Gould related the story of an older boy that lured him away from his home with promises of, quote, going to see the soldiers, end quote. After beating Gould severely, Pomeroy then slashed the boy's head with a knife. But this time, Gould provided a better description of his assailant than previous victims and greatly assisted the police in finding the culprit of all of these attacks. Gould described his attacker as an older boy, quote, with an eye like white marble, end quote. Police now believed they had an ample lead and set about to discover the identity of their, quote, inhuman scamp, end quote. On September 21, 1872, police took Joseph Kennedy to every elementary school in South Boston to try and identify his attacker. For some reason, Kennedy was unable to do so, but unknown to the police, Pomeroy would be within their grasp, as for some unknown reason, he walked into the police station where Joseph Kennedy sat waiting for the police to finish with him. Throughout the rest of his life, Pomeroy never expressed any feelings of remorse for the cruel and brutal actions he took on young children, and at the time when he strolled into the police station, he would not experience those emotions either. Historians and criminologists have hypothesized that Pomeroy may have been playing some sort of sick game in his head with the police. Most serial killers inject themselves into the investigation, or they write letters describing certain aspects of the crime that only the killer or the police would know. Or perhaps, deep down inside, he wanted to get caught. When Pomeroy saw Kennedy within the police station, he immediately turned around and headed toward the exit to the street. By that time, it was too late. Kennedy saw Pomeroy from across the room and identified his attacker to police. Authorities placed Pomeroy into a cell, then tried to extract a confession from him, but the young man refused to say anything, proclaiming his innocence the whole time during the investigation. In those days, before Miranda v. Arizona 1966, police could do those sorts of things where they refused the suspect access to legal help and even held suspects for long periods of time, hoping they would eventually crack. The police waited well after midnight and tried to get a confession from Pomeroy again. They threatened him with a 100-year sentence if he didn't confess. At that point, Pomeroy confessed his crimes. The next day, the police were able to assemble all of the victims where they made a positive identification that Pomeroy was the boy who attacked and tortured them. Pomeroy appeared before a magistrate on that afternoon where his victims recounted their attacks. Ruth Pomeroy also took the stand in defense of her son where she claimed, quote, he was a good boy, obedient and hardworking, end quote. When asked if he had anything to say for himself, Pomeroy merely stated, quote, I just couldn't help myself, end quote. The judge's sentence was swift and, considering the institution to which he would be sentenced, merciless. Pomeroy would serve his sentence at the House of Reformation at Westboro until he reached the age of majority, 18. In dealing with juvenile delinquents, especially those as cantankerous and violent as Pomeroy, military discipline, hard work, and training for a trade were the remedies. Westboro became a, quote, house of horrors, end quote, so to speak, where malefactor young boys were sentenced to reform. Unfortunately, and like most other reform schools at the time, stronger, bullyish boys preyed upon the weaker of the population. In Westboro, though, more nonviolent boys were placed. In essence, the vicious mentalities, such as the one that Pomeroy possessed, flourished as he did prey on the weaker of the group. Pomeroy thought desperately as to how he could be discharged before his 18th birthday. During his tenure at Westboro, Pomeroy stood out as a model prisoner and convinced the school officials that he truly reformed his ways under their tutelage. His time there was not without expressing the violent behavior that saw his incarceration. After being there a year, Pomeroy was approached by one of the teachers who stated she saw a snake. Pomeroy, anxious to show his reformed ways, volunteered to handle the snake for her. He picked up a stick, found the snake, and then beat the snake to a bloody mess on the ground, whipping himself into a heated rage. Ruth Pomeroy, still convinced of her son's innocence, conducted a letter-writing campaign to the Westboro Board of Reformers, desperately trying to convince them that her son was not capable of such travesties. But it was not her consistent and habitual letter-writing that got her son released. It was her son himself. When investigators from the state of Massachusetts visited the Pomeroy residence, they determined that Ruth Pomeroy was a hard-working woman, and her other son, Charles, was an industrious and entrepreneurial young man, having established a large paper route and operated a newspaper stand out of his mother's dress shop. With this report and the recommendation of even the Boston police that Pomeroy had suffered enough, less than 2 years after his arrest, state officials released him from Westboro. One of the things that authorities failed to do, and would have eventually saved the lives of other children, was to warn the Pomeroy neighbors that the youth who so brutally tortured several children before the age of 13 was now released on the public. Pomeroy had been freed no less than 6 weeks when one morning, March 18, 1874, he walked across the street from his mother's home to open her dress shop and his brother's newsstand. At about this time, a young errand boy that Ruth Pomeroy used, Rudolph Core, came to the shop to see if his services were needed that morning. Pomeroy and Core spoke for a little while. At approximately 8:20 a.m., a pretty young 10-year-old neighborhood girl in a green and black plaid dress named Katie Curran entered the shop to inquire as to whether the store inventory included notebooks. A new teacher at school was starting that day, and Katie was excited about her first day with the new teacher and decided that she needed a new notebook for the class. The little girl stated to Pomeroy that she had to be back at her house by 8:30 in order to walk her little sister to school. With his one good eye, Pomeroy looked at the young girl and then turned to Core, gave him a few coins, and asked if the young man would go to the local butcher shop down the street to purchase some scraps of meat for the cat. Pomeroy then turned to Katie and stated that his mother kept a store downstairs and there was a notebook that had a huge ink stain on the front of it, and he would be willing to sell it to her for 2 cents less than the price on the cover. Katie acknowledged Pomeroy's unspoken invitation, and then the two went into the basement for the notebook. Later, in his own words, Pomeroy stated what happened next. "I followed her, put my arm around her neck, hand over her mouth, and with my knife cut her throat. I then dragged her behind the water closet, laying her head furthest upon the place, and I put some stones and some ashes over the body." What Pomeroy failed to mention in a later statement was that he nearly severed Katie's head from her body, and the body exhibited a severe state of decomposition by the time the authorities found her. Her dress had huge slices going up the front. It became evident that Pomeroy brutalized the young woman in a sexual way. By the time he completed his gory work, Pomeroy heard his brother enter the store. He then washed his hands at a pipe coming from the water closet and then hurried back upstairs as if nothing ever happened. Katie Curran's mother, Mary, became very concerned when her daughter failed to return home after trying to procure the notebook. Katie never left the house without telling her mother where she was going and was not the sort of child just to run off. Mary Curran visited Tobin's General Store and spoke with the proprietor, who informed her that the girl had been there earlier, but because he was out of the notebook that Katie desired, he sent the girl over to Mrs. Pomeroy's store. At that time, Mary Curran shuddered with uncontrollable dread as she heard the stories about young Jesse Pomeroy and feared the worst. Mary Curran actually fainted when Tobin told her the distressing news. Once news of the girl's disappearance got around the neighborhood, everyone thought the worst. With Mary Curran visibly shaken, she visited the local police precinct to voice her concerns. She met with Captain Henry Dyer, who assured the worried mother that, quote, "I understand that he was completely rehabilitated in reform school. Besides, he only hurts little boys. He never attacked a girl," end quote. The police tried to quell Mary Curran's worries with a belittling address and stated that Katie probably got lost and would return home later that evening. Rudolph Corr saw Mary Curran the next day and reported to her that he saw Katie in the Pomeroy store the day she disappeared. Mary Curran made a second visit to the police station, where she again met with Captain Dyer, who assured her that Rudolph Corr had a reputation of being a liar. But to soothe her worry, Captain Dyer sent a Detective Adams to the Pomeroys to inquire as to her daughter's whereabouts. When Detective Adams visited the Pomeroy store, an angry Ruth Pomeroy met the detective at the door, saying she understood that her son was suspected, but allowed the detective to search the store anyway. After a brief, cursory look, Detective Adams left the store with his apologies toward Mrs. Pomeroy. For the next few weeks, police tried to follow every lead that came their way in the Curran case, even that her father forced the girl out of town to attend a convent. The father was Catholic and Mary Curran was Protestant. Anti-Catholic fervor ran high in Boston in those days, so no one would tremor if that were the resolution to the Curran case. Eventually, with the exception of Mary Curran, talk of the case died down. A few weeks later, not being able to control his urges, Pomeroy lured a 5-year-old boy by the name of Harry Field into a doorway off Vernon Street. About the time when Pomeroy was about to commit his crime, an old acquaintance from his old neighborhood happened by, and Pomeroy and he engaged in an argument. While the two argued, little Harry yanked his hand away from Pomeroy's and managed to escape. When he ran home, Harry burst open the door and literally jumped into his mother's arms, crying and unable to speak. Pomeroy's next victim would not be that lucky. In April of 1874, the Millen family moved onto Dorchester Street, just across the way from the Curran family. The Millen family's youngest child, Horace, was 4 years old, dark eyes, and, quote, shiny blonde locks, end quote. On one particular day, April 22, 1874, Horace dressed in a black and white jacket, a red and white check shirt with velvet trim, a black velvet hat with a gold tassel, and black knickers. Horace was known to love sweet confectionaries, and, on this day, his mother gave him some coins and sent him on his way to a local bakery. On the way there, he met an older boy who tempted him with sweets. The two boys then journeyed hand in hand together to a local sweet shop where Horace bought a small cake and shared it with the older boy. The older boy, of course, Pomeroy, suggested that the two take a walk to the nearby harbor to see a new steamship docked there. The two left the shop hand in hand and walked to the nearest harbor. Witnesses reported seeing the two boys, with the older boy exhibiting an almost uncontrollable excitement as the two traveled together. But they never reported it, seeing that the older boy looked very responsible and didn't worry that any harm would come to young Horace. Although those that witnessed the two together thought it strange that a boy dressed so formally would be in that part of town, they did not think twice, as it appeared the two boys were brothers. When Pomeroy and Horace crossed a ditch close to the harbor, they ran into a boy a little older than Pomeroy, Robert Benson, who was digging for clams. Gunshots could be heard in the distance, and Pomeroy asked the clam-digging teenager why they heard gunshots. Benson replied that people were duck hunting in the marshy part of the area. Pomeroy and Horace then walked away from the harbor to a more secluded area. When they arrived at a ditch in the wilderness, away from any prying eyes, Pomeroy wanted to rest. So Horace sat down, and in a swift movement that caught the young boy off guard, Pomeroy took out his knife, the same one he used on Katie Curran, and in a swift, brutal stroke, sliced open Horace's throat. Horace surprised Pomeroy due to the fact that after such a deep and blood-gushing wound, he was still alive. Pomeroy then made a frenzied attack, stabbing the young boy over and over again. Horace fought back, but eventually Pomeroy sliced through the boy's windpipe, extinguishing his life. When the attack concluded, Pomeroy stabbed Horace Millen over 15 times. A later examination of Horace's body revealed that his eye had been punctured through the eyelid and his pubic area suffered extreme mutilations. From all indications, Horace Millen, the innocent young boy whose family had just moved to a new home, died an excruciating death at the hands of Jesse Pomeroy. Authorities later determined that Horace Millen died at approximately 12 noon. At approximately 4 p.m., Millen's body would be found by two brothers playing on the beach nearby, who later retrieved the men hunting ducks, who, in turn, watched over the corpse until the police could be summoned. John Millen, Horace's father, went to the local police station at approximately 5:30 p.m. and reported that his son never returned home from a trip to a local sweet shop. The police made note of what the boy was wearing at the time of his disappearance and then stated they would be on the lookout for young Horace. The police would later discover that the boy's mutilated remains had already been discovered and brought to the coroner for an examination. After a coroner's jury assembled and made the determination as to the cause of death, several newspaper reporters who gathered for the proceeding wrote their stories and disseminated the information, whereupon police sent out bulletins to neighboring departments. Finally, an officer arrived at the Millen home to deliver the news regarding the death of their son. When contemplating what type of individual could do this to a young child, the answer became clear to those who knew the signature of the killer and the past tortures of young males and females. Jesse Pomeroy was the answer. But at that time, newspapermen and authorities believed the deviant tormentor of young children was still locked away in Westboro Reform School, unaware that Satan's spawn had already been released almost a year before. Police dispatched officers to the Pomeroy home where they found Jesse Pomeroy, and against his mother's protests and Pomeroy's affirmations that he had done nothing wrong, authorities took the young man into custody. Pomeroy sustained a barrage of questions from the police, but one thing stood out to the inquisitive lawmen. Pomeroy could not account for his time between 11 a.m. and 3 p.m. on the day that Horace Millen disappeared. Additionally, when the police first arrested the youth, he had, in his possession, quote, a knife spotted with blood. A spot marked the breast of his undershirt, and his boots were covered with mud of that particular hue and consistency that belongs alone to the soil of the marshlands, end quote. Jesse Pomeroy maintained his innocence until approximately noon on the following day, April 23, 1874. Pomeroy confessed wholeheartedly to the murder of Horace Millen. After the frustration that authorities exhibited as a result of Pomeroy's steadfast denials and defying the police to prove his culpability in the Millen murder, one of the detectives, stifled by Pomeroy's protestations of innocence, brought the boy to the undertaker in charge of the arrangements for the burial of little Horace. When the detective pulled back the sheet covering the little boy's face, the detective forced Pomeroy to look at the mangled body of this once attractive youth and then asked Pomeroy if he knew the little boy. Pomeroy responded that he knew him. When asked if he killed him, Pomeroy responded, quote, I suppose I did, end quote. This was the first and only time that Pomeroy would show remorse for his diabolical actions. At this time, authorities and the public began to ask, where is Katie Curran? On the 27th of April, 1874, arraignment for Pomeroy was held in the Highlands Municipal Court, where Pomeroy stood charged with the murder of Horace Millen. The coroner requested that the young man not answer to any of the charges until a more thorough investigation could be made of the Millen murder and any other substantial leads that the authorities may investigate. Furthermore, the boy did not have the advantage of present counsel. The judge agreed with the coroner and determined that any further proceedings should be postponed. By the end of the month, authorities held no doubt that Jesse Pomeroy, in fact, murdered Horace Millen. In July of 1874, while Pomeroy waited in jail to determine the course that authorities would take, his mother decided that the family should move from their present location. Ruth Pomeroy became weary of the constant stares and underbreath murmurs around South Boston. When she and her other son, Charles, moved, her former co-tenant decided to expand his business. This meant that the basement of the Pomeroy's former shop would have to be expanded. It did not take long for the workmen to find the badly decomposed remains of Katie Curran. Authorities arrested Ruth and Charles Pomeroy partly due to some leverage in order to get Pomeroy to confess to the murder of Katie Curran, and partly for protective custody, fearing that a mob would attempt to lynch the two and blame the mother for her son's atrocious behavior. A subsequent examination of Katie Curran's corpse revealed that she suffered similar wounds to that of Horace Millen, and police exhibited no doubt that Jesse Pomeroy murdered the young girl. Authorities gave Jesse Pomeroy 2 days with which to think over whether he would confess or not. The arrest of Ruth and Charles did not seem to have any effect on him, but soon he realized that they would pay for his crimes if he did not confess. Therefore, he confessed to the murder of Katie Curran with accuracy. So accurate, in fact, that seasoned homicide detectives cringed when Pomeroy discussed the means by which he murdered the young girl. When asked why he killed the girl, Pomeroy simply answered, quote, "I just wanted to see how she would act," end quote. At this point, Pomeroy appeared to be culpable in 2 murders. Pomeroy's only option at this point was to prove that he was insane, not a medical term, but a legal one. Thus, the confessed murderer fell under the standard of the MacNaughton rules. In England in the 1830s, Daniel MacNaughton murdered the secretary of the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Robert Peel. When MacNaughton stood trial, the jury was disturbed that he was mentally unstable and did not have it in their consciences to hang a sick man. So instead of hanging, they sentenced the troubled young man to a mental institution. The MacNaughton rules established that a jury or judge must determine whether the accused understood the charges against him, was he able to assist in his own defense, or did he or she understand the difference between right and wrong at the time of the commission of the crime. Because of the seriousness of the crimes and the obvious depravity Pomeroy used while torturing and then killing his victims, the public clamored for justice and demanded that the accused child killer be executed. However, in order to save his life, his attorneys believed that they could bargain for a lesser sentence if they could prove that their client was insane. 3 alienists were called to examine the young man, and in the first few sessions with the mental health professionals, he freely admitted to torturing young children and then killing them. After Pomeroy received a note from his mother, he stopped talking as freely with the doctors. Approximately 2 months before his trial, Pomeroy denied any wrongdoing and recanted his confessions in front of Dr. John Tyler, one of the 3 alienists. In essence, Dr. Tyler concluded that Pomeroy showed no remorse for his actions, and Jesse could discriminate between right and wrong. The boy was, and forever would be, a threat to society. He needed to be carefully restrained of his liberty that others may not be endangered. Therefore, Dr. Tyler surmised, Jesse Pomeroy was insane. Charles Robinson, Pomeroy's attorney, hoped to keep Pomeroy out of prison. Pomeroy, on the other hand, hoped to do a short jail stint and then be allowed to join the Navy, where they would show him discipline. Pomeroy's trial began on December 8, 1874, and made headlines all over the nation. However, unlike some trials in the present day, this trial did not take very long. The jury was seated in less than an hour, and the prosecution's opening arguments took half that long. The prosecutor for the state, John May, brought witness after witness to the stand who placed Pomeroy with the 2 victims. When the state rested, Robinson opened his arguments with the tragic life of his client, perhaps in an effort to get the jury to show Pomeroy some mercy. Robinson related how Pomeroy could not control his impulses and felt compelled to torture and murder. During both the prosecution and defense cases, Pomeroy sat with his hands clasped behind his neck, looking unconcerned as to his fate. Robinson laid the foundation for an insanity defense and called layman witnesses to testify to the fact. The 2 defense alienists who examined Pomeroy testified that the defendant, in fact, was insane. The prosecution's alienist, Dr. George T. Choate, testified that although Pomeroy was cunning and cruel, he could find no sign of insanity. On December 9, 1874, after closing arguments, the jury went into deliberations. After 5 hours of deliberation, the jury reached a verdict: guilty of murder in the 1st degree with premeditation. The mandatory sentence for this crime in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts was certainly death by hanging. But because of the defendant's age, the jury asked that clemency be given to the young man. Only the governor of the state could grant that type of clemency. The question of commutation was left to the governor of the state. Because of post-trial motions, sentencing was delayed until mid-February 1875, when Judge Horace Gray sentenced Pomeroy to death. Judge Gray ordered the guards to take Pomeroy to jail to await execution. Governor William Gaston formed a committee to answer the question as to whether such a young defendant should be executed. The committee met and came back to Governor Gaston hopelessly divided. The state's chief executive then had an open hearing where advocates and opponents could voice their opinions as to whether a 14-year-old boy should be executed. Governor Gaston listened to the arguments and stated that he would take the arguments under advisement and waited several weeks before even mentioning the case again. Governor Gaston did not want to execute Pomeroy, and this would cost him the election of 1876. His opponent in that race, Alexander Rice, pledged that he would see Pomeroy hang for his crimes. 2 years after murdering Katie Curran and Horace Millen, Governor Rice gathered his advisors and determined that the case was now too removed in time for anyone to really care, but that any punishment deemed upon Pomeroy must be severe. Governor Rice then sentenced Pomeroy to life imprisonment. To make the sentence more severe, Governor Rice ordered Pomeroy's sentence to be served for the rest of his life in solitary confinement at the state prison at Charlestown. Ruth Pomeroy was the only visitor that he received for years after his sentencing. The existence that Pomeroy endured in prison befitted the type of personality he developed. He ate alone, exercised alone, and spent countless hours in his cell reading the books that prison officials would allow him to digest. He often thought about escaping. Throughout his whole incarceration, Pomeroy maintained his innocence and that he was wrongly convicted. In 1917, after several governors had passed through the executive mansion in Boston, the restrictions first placed on Pomeroy through Governor Rice saw a relaxation, and Pomeroy joined the general population of Charlestown. When new inmates came to the prison as a result of being sentenced there, Pomeroy would approach them, introduce himself, and then, quote, ask them what they knew about him, end quote. Eventually, though, very few inmates coming to the prison in the following years had ever heard of Charlestown's most famous inmate. When Pomeroy's health began to fail, prison officials moved him from Charlestown to the Bridgewater Prison Farm in 1929, when Pomeroy reached the age of 71. In 1931, Pomeroy passed away, and the press dismissed him as the, quote, most friendless person in the world, end quote, and a psychopath.
Although Jesse Harding Pomeroy stood convicted of only 2 horrific murders, historians have contended that he may have been responsible for as many as 10 homicides committed the same way with the same signatures involved. The one problem we have as a society is trying to convince ourselves that perhaps children like Jesse Pomeroy are incapable of such horrendous crimes. But history either proves us wrong, or we become more sympathetic to the upbringing of such demonstrative displays of deviancy. We tend to blame atmosphere and even society as a whole when confronted with such dastardly deeds, such as a child who never realized the difference between right and wrong. Perhaps we see a fascination with the violence around us that makes these children, for lack of a better word, see what it is like to senselessly kill another human being. No matter how long we study this behavior, the answers seem to elude us, causing society to produce more and more of these, quote, lost, end quote, or forgotten children who seek the attention that infamy provides. Often when we view motion picture portrayals of famous criminals or crimes in history, the whole truth cannot be told due to the graphic nature of the crime or crimes, or there are time constraints on production. In this profile of True Crime: Man's Dark Imagination, we investigate the true story of a ghoul, a grave robber, a middle-aged man who followed the dictates of his overbearing and religious zealot mother involving morality, later to turn those misunderstood declarations into a rather morbid and, in some instances, deadly inclination.
Sheriff Art Schley of Plainfield, Wisconsin, arrived at a small farmhouse outside of the city limits. The reason for Sheriff Schley's visit stemmed from the investigation into the disappearance of a local shopkeeper, Miss Bernice Warden. What led the lawman to this particular residence regarded the discovery of a receipt found on the floor of Warden's store, a blood trail, and some missing cash from the register. As the sheriff stood at the front door, he held a search warrant in his hand, but the owner was not home. Sheriff Schley decided to enter the premises and just take a look around for himself. As he entered the side door of the house, Sheriff Schley made his way through the darkened kitchen where rubbish appeared in every direction that he turned, and he bumped into something but could not quite recognize what caught his attention. The lawman turned on his flashlight to give him more of a vision of what he might further encounter. When he turned to see what touched him when he first walked in, Sheriff Schley, at first struck with disbelief, shuddered in horror and disgust. A human body hung from one of the beams, beheaded, disemboweled, gutted, and prepared for dressing. He started to become very sick, but then regained his composure. The body turned out to be that of Ms. Warden. Sheriff Schley went looking throughout the rest of the house and subsequently found Ms. Warden's head in a sack. Her ears had been nailed to her head with a piece of twine connecting the two nails. Investigators made the observation that it appeared to whomever did this, Ms. Warden's head had been prepared to be mounted as a trophy. This was not the only grotesque display of butchery. As detectives congregated to the farmhouse to do a more thorough search, they noticed parts of female anatomy around the abode, some dried and fashioned into horrific artifacts: a belt speckled with nipples, a soup bowl fashioned from a human skull, lampshades and chairs covered with human skin, a box filled with human noses, and what appeared to be some sort of pull made with female lips. Investigators also found a shoebox under the bed that contained what looked like female genitalia and a shirt in the closet made from human skin with a pair of breasts attached to the front. Hanging on the wall next to the closet were the faces of 9 women, carefully preserved and set upon the wall as if they were trophies of a human hunter. As investigators searched more thoroughly throughout the residence, they kept asking themselves what could make a human being do this to another. What strange appetites did this person possess that would cause him to butcher other human beings in making such horrific artifacts? The middle-aged man, obviously disturbed, had been known as a loner and somewhat, quote, off, end quote, by the locals. But neighbors never dreamed that this diminutive little man could hide a secret this dark for so long. The farmhouse that police searched that day belonged to Edward Theodore Gein, Ed to the locals. Ed was born in La Crosse, Wisconsin to parents George and Augusta Gein on August 27, 1906, the second of 2 boys. Henry, Ed's brother, was 5 years his senior. Ed's childhood, from what is gleaned through the historical record, smattered of the results of a deeply religious and mostly fanatical mother. Augusta determined that her sons would grow in an environment of a strict moral code and warned the Gein boys about the immorality and looseness of women. In doing so, Augusta sincerely hoped that she could quell any sexual desires the boys exhibited and live an equally pious life as she, yet denying themselves any pleasures, even the simple ones that humans enjoy. Mrs. Gein was a viciously domineering woman who sincerely believed that her law was absolute and any deviation from that law required divine punishment through her own hand. George Gein, Ed and Henry's father, had been described as a weak man and an alcoholic. It is any wonder that he and Augusta had any children, as she despised George and considered him to be a worthless human being. George had no say in how the two boys would be raised, and that was fine with Augusta. She took it upon herself to support the family, and taking charge, she started a grocery business in La Crosse the year that Ed was born. The family lived comfortably for the time, and Augusta saw to it that surplus money earned from the business went into savings. She wanted to move the family away from the city of La Crosse, alleviating any temptations for her sons to engage in pleasures of the flesh. In 1914, the Geins moved to Plainfield and purchased a 195-acre farm in the middle of nowhere, with the closest neighbors inhabiting a farm a quarter of a mile away. Even moving to this remote of a location, Augusta could not keep her sons away from the evils of the outside world. The boys had to attend school, where Ed proved himself as a mediocre student at best, but he excelled at reading and entertained himself for hours in his room reading adventure books and letting his imagination run wild. Most of Ed's schoolmates shunned the young boy because they viewed him as, quote, effeminate and shy, end quote, and did not make friends. Ed saw his mother as an angel who exhibited a great deal of goodness. He worshipped her and did anything to please her. But no matter what Ed or Henry did, Augusta never exhibited any satisfaction with their efforts. She verbally abused the boys and compared them to their father as a bastion of failure. Over time, the two boys relied on each other for any type of companionship, as making friends became impossible. Ed respected his older brother a great deal and considered him to be, quote, a hard worker and a man of great character, end quote. In 1940, George Gein died after years of alcoholic abuse, and Henry stepped up as the new man of the family. Both boys solicited their neighbors for odd jobs to help support the family. In fact, in doing so, Ed and Henry made quite the reputations for themselves around Plainfield as reliable and trustworthy young men. Ed became accustomed to babysitting and related well to the young children, as he did not receive any respect from boys his own age. But Henry started to see that Ed exhibited a strange attachment to their mother, which the older boy considered unhealthy. Several times, Henry openly criticized their mother, which stunned Ed. Some suspected that this led to a very tragic incident involving Henry, which culminated in his death. In May of 1944, Ed and Henry sought to fight a brush fire on their property. It was near the end of the day, and the two separated in an attempt to cover more ground and extinguish the fire more quickly. After a few short moments, Ed noticed that he could no longer locate his brother. When the police finally arrived after Ed called them to report his brother missing, searchers became surprised when Ed led them directly to Henry's body. It appeared that Henry suffered several bruises to his head, but the police never suspected any foul play. Rumors spread and were even documented in a 2000 movie entitled Ed Gein, where Ed and Henry went hunting, and Henry questioned Ed's undying loyalty to his mother, even suggesting to his younger sibling that he marry their mother. The film portrays Ed becoming enraged as his brother stated he met a woman and wanted to move out of the house. As Ed became more agitated, he struck Henry with the rifle he held and left his brother there as the fire moved toward an unconscious, or probably deceased, Henry. Augusta Gein seemed to have more of a hold on Ed than Henry, and some have analyzed this relationship with particular interest, especially when the younger brother's future actions and behavior denoted some deep, penetrating psychopathy. Augusta Gein, what can be determined from the historical record, grew up as a heavy-set, large-breasted woman raised in a deeply religious Lutheran household. Augusta's childhood can only be summarized as having a supremely strict father who took seriously the adage of, quote, spare the rod, spoil the child, end quote. When George Gein married Augusta, their marriage seemed doomed from the start. Augusta tended to belittle her husband, and the thought of sex, which George contemplated often, disgusted the young but portly bride. It was any wonder the two actually got together to conceive two sons. Augusta believed, quote, fornication and adultery were the worst of sins, end quote. She believed that sex, even after marriage, served the purpose of the husband's lust and was a duty the wife had to perform. After their marriage, Augusta wanted a baby and performed her wifely duty. Therefore, Henry was born on January 17, 1901, and Ed in 1906. Once the boys were old enough to understand, Augusta's disdain for sex was imparted upon the children. She hated men and believed that a little girl would be easier to raise and what she considered, quote, more likely to be chaste and pious, sober and obedient, end quote. But then Augusta gave birth to Ed. Although the birth proved a disappointment to the young mother, she continued with her life and never gave in to despair. At the time, and according to sources, Augusta vowed that Edward Theodore Gein would grow up pure, not the lustful, swearing, and cursed creatures that inhabited the earth. It seemed that Augusta gave up on Henry and his religious upbringing. But Ed, that was another story. This may have provided clues as to Ed's future behavior, but it seemed that the middle-aged man ran amok with his desires and canonization of his mother in rather bizarre ways. After Henry's death, Ed became the last real relative Augusta possessed. When rumors swirled that Ed may have had something to do with Henry's demise, people reacted in disbelief at the insinuation that this mild-mannered man would be involved in the death of his brother. Even if he did murder Henry in an uncontrollable rage, Ed was certainly capable of such a despicable act. But then again, Henry may have insulted Ed's, quote, saintly, end quote, mother. Nevertheless, the coroner listed Henry's cause of death as asphyxiation. Even though Henry may have threatened to leave Ed alone with their mother because of his newfound romance, the younger son did not have a lot of time with Augusta. After a series of strokes, Augusta succumbed and passed away on December 29, 1945. Having lost his only friend in the world, as well as the only woman he loved, seemed to trigger something within the middle-aged loner. From the outside world, Ed lived on the farm, alone, off his minuscule earnings from his inconsistent jobs, and rented rooms in his house to unsuspecting guests. But the upstairs room stood as a shrine to Augusta, a creepy collection of her belongings and other unusual objects that Ed Gein used to remember his mother's presence. He only occupied the lower level of the house, making extensive use of the kitchen and the front living room where he slept nightly. Long after his mother's death, Gein began occupying his time with reading fantasy novels and books on anatomy. He engrossed himself with the tales spun in fictional novels and instructional pamphlets on how to shrink heads, exhume bodies, and also lost treasures. More oddly at this time, even with his weird behavior, parents still sought out the lonely man to babysit their children, and he would regale them with the stories that he digested to entertain his charges. During this time, Gein developed a bizarre hobby. He made nightly excursions to the local cemetery. Moreover, Gein took a keen interest in the obituaries from the daily newspapers, where he learned of recent deaths of local women. Later, when questioned by authorities, Gein made it a point to emphasize that he went to the cemetery on his nocturnal visits. This allegedly, quote, quenched his lust, end quote, but maintained that he never had sexual intercourse with the dead bodies because, in his words, quote, they smelled too bad, end quote. It was also at this time that Ed Gein decided he would take an interest in wearing human skin. One of the hobbies that he later mastered concerning peeling the skin from some of the dead bodies and wear them as masks around his residence, where no one could see. It seemed that his ghoulish endeavors resulted in stealing several female bodies from the cemetery to bring them to his lair, fashioning several female body parts for display. Gein often took the entire skin from female bodies, including their breasts and other organs, to wear because he held an unhealthy fascination of what it would be like to be a female and have that power over men. One young boy that Gein cared for visited him at his home and spoke of the shrunken heads that Gein displayed throughout his home, telling the young boy that he acquired them through ads from the South Pacific. When the young boy told his parents about the odd menagerie, they dismissed them as tales of a young boy's fancy. But later, two other young boys who visited Gein's residence stated the same thing without ever having an association with the original young boy, stating that they witnessed women's heads preserved in the refrigerator. The young children who witnessed these oddities thought they made very strange Halloween costumes, or so Gein told them. Soon thereafter, Rumors began to circulate about the objects in Gein's house, but no one took the story seriously until years later when they realized what type of deranged person Gein had become. In the 1940s and 1950s, the state of Wisconsin experienced a number of missing persons reports. 4 cases, in particular, caused authorities great consternation. Georgia Weckler, 8 years old at the time of her disappearance, walked home from school on May 1, 1947, and no one saw her again. Massive search efforts ensued around the area where she was last seen around Jefferson, Wisconsin, but to no avail. The only evidence investigators relied on were the tire tracks found near the area where little Georgia disappeared. Authorities later determined that the tire tracks were from a Ford vehicle, but they had very little else to go on. In 1953, 15-year-old Evelyn Hartley had been babysitting at the time of her disappearance when her father tried to contact her by telephone at the place where she babysat and received no answer with his repeated calls. Mr. Hartley frantically drove to the residence where Evelyn babysat that night. When Evelyn's father looked through one of the windows of the house, he noticed one of Evelyn's shoes and her glasses laying on the floor of the living room. When Mr. Hartley attempted to enter the house, he noticed that all the windows and doors appeared locked, save one, the basement window. When the father crawled into the window, he noticed blood stains and panicked in the search for his daughter. In the living room, Mr. Hartley noticed what appeared to be signs of a struggle. He called the police immediately after these discoveries, and when investigators arrived on the scene, they noticed blood on the grass in the front yard, a bloody handprint on a neighbor's house, footprints, and Evelyn's other shoe on the basement floor. A regional search ensued, but authorities and searchers found no leads as to where Evelyn may have been or held captive. A few days later, someone discovered some bloody clothing that reportedly belonged to Evelyn. Police suspected foul play in her disappearance. Evelyn simply vanished, never to be seen again. In November of 1952, almost a year before the disappearance of Evelyn Hartley, 2 men sat in a Plainfield bar before setting off to hunting. Victor Travis and Ray Burgess sat at the bar drinking for hours before leaving. They left the bar and were never seen again. In the winter of 1954, a local tavern owner and personality in Plainfield, Mary Hogan, disappeared from her place of business. The only leads that police gathered from her place of business was a trail of blood that led from the tavern floor to the parking lot. Also discovered in the tavern was a shell casing, and therefore, the police only speculated as to what happened to the jovial bar owner. Authorities then suspected that most of the disappearances had one thing in common. They all occurred in or around Plainfield, Wisconsin. After Ed Gein's arrest in November 1957, authorities sought to interrogate the loner to gain some insight as to his motives and actions that culminated in the search warrant to his residence. As investigators remained at the Gein residence, they suspected that Gein may have been responsible for the rash of disappearances in the area. After all, Mary Worden's body, or what was left of it, hung in the house near the kitchen, and Gein lived among his souvenirs as if they were a butterfly collection and not human parts. Police wondered what other oddities would they find. They immediately set to digging on the Gein property. As the excavations began, authorities interviewed Gein at the Watoma County jailhouse. When first interrogated, Gein refused admission to anything. Then, after a day or more of questioning, Gein related the story of how he murdered Mary Worden. Autopsy reports later listed that Worden succumbed to a .22 caliber gunshot wound to the head. Gein could not remember the exact details of the murder and claimed he wandered Plainfield that day in a dazed state of confusion. He remembered absconding with cash from the cash register, dragging Worden's body to his Ford truck, but nothing else. Intensely questioned, Gein refused to admit whether he murdered anyone as the remains found in his residence, stating instead that the body parts came from bodies he excavated from the local cemetery. Investigators hounded the suspect for days thereafter in the hopes of gaining additional information. Finally, Gein admitted to the murder of Mary Hogan, again stating that he worked within a dazed state of confusion and could not relate the exact details of the incident, sufficing to say that he, quote, accidentally, end quote, shot her. During the many hours of his interrogation, Gein seemed almost emotionless and giddy at describing the murders of Warden and Hogan, although he still claimed he remembered nothing. The enormity of his crimes never once struck him as he described both the murders and the grave robbing with a matter-of-fact intensity. Because of his nonchalant revelations, authorities seriously questioned Gein's sanity and even advocated for psychological tests. Psychiatrists determined that Gein suffered from some sort of emotional impairment. Other psychiatrists and psychologists determined that Gein also suffered from schizophrenia and deemed the middle-aged ghoul to be a sexual psychopath. Doctors reasoned that the conditions for which he had been diagnosed stemmed from the unhealthy relationship he had with his mother, in addition to his upbringing and the lack of any relationships with women during his lifetime other than his mother. Psychiatrists theorized that Gein had a natural sexual attraction to women, but because of Augustus' instillment of, quote, unnatural attitudes, end quote, Gein exhibited a love-hate relationship toward the fairer sex, and this relationship became overly exaggerated into what the mental health professionals deemed, quote, a psychosis, end quote. As the interrogations continued, investigators searching the Gein farmhouse made another gruesome discovery: the remains of approximately 10 females. Even though Gein exclaimed that the remains from 8 additional women, other than Hogan and Warden, were from the exhumation of bodies from the cemetery, police exhibited skepticism at the murderer's claim. Authorities supported the high possibility that the remains could have come from the cemetery, but they would have to investigate the cemetery further to determine the validity of Gein's claims. After several questions arose as to the morality surrounding the exhumation of the bodies, police determined the exact location of the graves Gein had desecrated to obtain the female parts found in his residence. All of the coffins examined showed signs that someone had tampered with them very recently, and most showed body parts missing. On November 29, 1957, authorities made another discovery on the Gein farm that brought suspicion on Gein whether he murdered a third person. While digging in one of the more secluded areas of the property, police discovered the remains of a corpse. Investigators suspected these remains to be that of Victor Travis, one of the men who disappeared in November of 1952. But tests performed on the corpse determined it to be that of a large, middle-aged woman, perhaps one of Gein's exhumations from the graveyard. Despite their rigorous searches of the Gein property, authorities could not substantially charge Gein with the previous disappearances, but did manage to charge the middle-aged loner with the murders of Bernice Warden and Mary Hogan. It became painfully obvious that Plainfield, Wisconsin, had never experienced a sensation such as the one that unfolded before their eyes with the tale of Ed Gein, the ghoul. The story seemed so unreal, yet when the evidence gathered at the Gein farm and surrounding land were made public, reporters from all over the English-speaking world flocked to this small area of Wisconsin to gather any juicy tidbit about Gein they could find. As with true crime, the world, although repulsed by the actions of this, quote, mama's boy, end quote, found a morbid fascination with his existence. Gein rose to celebrity status with all the news coverage he received as a result of his macabre acts and the publicizing of his souvenirs. A difficulty arose when citizens of the town, seeking their newfound fame, contributed more to the legend than the actual facts surrounding this bizarre case. Most of the denizens who spoke to reporters never really said anything bad about Gein, but they did report that he seemed a little on the quirky side. Even though the truth stared them in the faces regarding this eclectic little man, they still found it hard to believe that Ed Gein responsible for murder and the almost illicit behavior, such as the collection of souvenirs from dead bodies. But the truth stood hard to ignore. Soon after the interrogations concluded, Gein was placed into a mental asylum for further evaluation, and the doctors there determined him to be incompetent to stand trial. No longer in fear of being tried for first-degree murder, people from Plainfield voiced their anger that Gein would not face trial for the murders of Bernice Warden and Mary Hogan. But there was little they could do to influence the court to try Gein for the 2 murders. Gein was subsequently sentenced to the Central State Hospital at Waupun, Wisconsin. Subsequent to his committal, county authorities put the Gein farm up for auction along with many of the ghoul's possessions. This brought many curiosity seekers to the area to view the house and investigate which of Gein's possessions would be auctioned off, perhaps seeking a piece of crime history for themselves. The company handling the auction at the time sought to charge onlookers 50 cents to go into the house. This outraged the citizens of Plainfield, who believed that the whole incident turned into a circus where the Gein household quickly reverted to a, quote, museum to the morbid, end quote. The company that held the auction was later forbidden from charging an entrance fee, but this did very little to satisfy the angered citizens of Plainfield. On the morning of March 20th, 1958, the Plainfield Fire Department responded to a fire at the Gein residence. The house quickly burned to the ground, and although authorities suspected arson, no proof existed to substantiate their assumptions. No suspects ever emerged. The fire happened to destroy a great deal of Gein's possessions, but his car, the 1949 Ford sedan used to transport the dead bodies, sparking a bidding war, and the car later sold for $660. The new owner of the vehicle later took the car to various fairs where he charged admission for patrons to see the, quote, ghoul car, end quote. Ed's response to the fire that destroyed his childhood home and the home where he and his mother lived until her death seemed very lackadaisical. Quote, just as well, end quote. After spending 10 years in a mental asylum, the court deemed Gein competent to stand trial. On January 22, 1968, the proceedings began to determine whether Gein was guilty or not by reason of insanity for the murder of Bernice Worden. The actual trial did not take place until November 7, 1968, when 7 witnesses took the stand against Gein. Several of the witnesses were lab technicians who performed the autopsy on Ms. Worden, and the sheriff and the deputy sheriff also testified. After only 1 week, with evidence stacked firmly against the, quote, Plainfield ghoul, end quote, the judge reached his verdict and found Gein guilty of first-degree murder. But because the judge deemed Gein insane at the time of the killings, he was later found not guilty by reason of insanity and acquitted. Subsequent to the trial, deputies escorted Gein back to the Central State Hospital for the criminally insane. Those relatives of the murdered women and those of the graves who had been desecrated never felt that they reached a level of closure, nor did Gein receive his just due. Throughout the rest of his life, the time Gein spent at Central State were happier than he had ever been his entire life. Gein kept to himself even though he got along with most of the patients there. During his stay at the hospital, Gein remained docile and never required any type of tranquilizing. Gein lived out his years until July 26, 1984, when he succumbed after a long bout with cancer. Ed Gein was buried next to his mother in Plainfield Cemetery.
The case of Edward Theodore Gein stands as a precedent when it comes to deviant behavior. In fact, this case became so infamous that 3 movies were made from the tales, somewhat fictionalized, of course. Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, Tobe Hooper's The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and finally, Jonathan Demme's Silence of the Lambs. Of course, the characters in those movies were only composites, but later, a full-length movie entitled In the Light of the Moon, starring Stephen Railsback, was produced in 2000. The audience watching the movie remarked how not only did Railsback do a remarkable job portraying the incomparable Ed Gein, but most will remember Railsback from another stellar performance as Charles Manson in the 1976 film Helter Skelter, about the Tate LaBianca murders. In that performance, one had to look closer to see whether Manson didn't actually portray himself. In 2015, Zach Bagans of Ghost Adventures infamy reportedly purchased a pot that once belonged to Ed Gein, where it was said that he boiled human remains before digesting them. There has never been any evidence that Gein was a cannibal. Perhaps he just wanted to see what it was like to have control over someone. including whether they rested in peace or in pieces. Until next time.
If you enjoyed our presentation of true crime, please like, subscribe, and hit the bell to receive notifications on any future programs.
Throughout this series, we have tried to present cases that may give us some insight as to the reasons behind various murders. There is a continuing cycle of evil that prevails in the minds of killers. This profile presents the facts of a most unusual case, a case that seemed to spawn many suspicions going into different directions, and serve throughout history as the epitome of one man's determination to disgrace his legacy through infamy.
On March 30th, 1892, a new tenant moved into a Windsor suburb house in the city of Melbourne, Australia, and complained of a terrible smell coming from the residence. Police arrived at the house and noticed the stench as well. Beneath a hearthstone near the fireplace, authorities located the body of a woman about 30 years old whose throat had been cut, buried, and decomposing for approximately 3 months. Melbourne police assigned 2 detectives to the case, Detective Sergeants William Considine and Henry Causey, and they set about investigating into the previous tenant. The leasing agent informed the 2 police officers that the previous tenant, a man named Druin, ordered that some cement, a broom, a trowel, closet pan, and a spade a few weeks earlier be delivered to the Windsor residence. Druin had been described as in his mid-30s, fair-haired with reddish tint and red beard, and a large distinctive mustache, and was of medium height in build. Mr. Druin dressed with a lot of flash, with a lot of jewelry and fine clothes. After an intricate search of the Andrew Street house, Detectives Considine and Causey discovered a worn luggage ticket that stated Druin arrived in Melbourne from England on December 9, 1891. On a passenger vessel named the Kaiser Wilhelm II, accompanied by his wife, Emily. Then Druin traveled under the name of Albert Williams. Detectives Considine and Causey also questioned the other passengers on the ship and
had no trouble recollecting the loud, boasting, oafish behavior of Mr. Williams, who brought anyone who could find to listen to his obviously fictitious adventures to every corner of the globe.
Williams also accused the passengers and crew of stealing valuables from him during the course of the journey. Detectives Considine and Causey believed that the badly decomposed corpse found at the residence located at 57 Andrew Street could have been no one other than Emily Williams. After their suspicions had been semi-confirmed that the woman buried under the hearthstone fit the general description of Emily Williams, the authorities issued a nationwide alert for Williams, and his description appeared in every police station all over Australia. The detectives believed that if Williams stuck to his modus operandi, he would not be that hard to apprehend. With a fugitive on the loose, the story of Emily Williams grabbed the headlines and saw the story travel throughout the world. A few days after the issuing of the description, an employee from a passenger liner stated that he recognized a man matching Williams's description who boarded a vessel on January 23rd from Melbourne to Perth in Western Australia. Detectives also learned that Williams had been traveling under another assumed name of, quote, Baron Swanston, end quote. Police finally located Baron Swanston in the small mining settlement of Southern Cross, where, upon his arrival, he took a job as an engineer in charge of machinery at the Fraser gold mine. Finally, on the day after Emily Williams had been laid to rest, Police officers in Southern Cross wired Melbourne detectives Considine and Causey, and they received a wire telegram from the area where Williams had been spotted that the police held the wiry suspect in their jail. Williams stated when police arrested him,
I am innocent. I have never been to Windsor, to the best of my knowledge. I do not know where it is.
After visiting the suspect in Southern Cross, detectives Considine and Causey became more familiar with the man they knew as Druin, or Williams, but later discovered his real name to be Frederick Bailey Deeming. Frederick Bailey Deeming was born on July 3, 1853, in Kent, England, to respectable parents. At the age of 16, after an unsuccessful career as a petty thief, Deeming went to sea, where he earned a living committing small crimes and fraud under false pretenses. Deeming made it back to England in February 1890, where he bigamously married a woman named Miss Matheson, whom Deeming deserted later. At the time, he already had a wife and 3 children. At the time of this philandering, Deeming and his English wife were expecting their 4th child. At some point in this time, Deeming and his wife fought incessantly, culminating in her disappearance along with the 4 children, including the newborn child. Deeming explained that his wife was really his sister and she left to be with her sailor husband. Deeming fled the area and went to Australia in September 1891. He rented a house at number 57 Andrew Street in the Melbourne suburb of Windsor, from where Deeming disappeared in March 1891. Deeming made it a habit to prepare himself before moving to his next victim. In preparing himself for the murder of Emily Mather, known earlier to police as Emily Williams, Deeming met and became engaged to another woman, with the understanding that she would follow him wherever he traveled. Before Deeming left the house at 57 Andrew Street in the Windsor suburb of Melbourne, Australia, he paid the rent in advance and subsequently met his betrothed. Deeming was now, as they say, in the wind, at least until authorities captured the fugitive in Southern Cross. When the passengers on the ship that traveled from Perth in Western Australia to Melbourne with the Williamses gave their statements to police, there seemed a great disparity between any resemblance of the woman described as Deeming's wife and the woman found under the hearthstone at Andrew Street residence. More specifically, that Mrs. Williams appeared to be older and huskier than the woman found underneath the hearthstone, shorter with a darker complexion. Detectives Considine and Causey believed for a short time there were 2 Mrs. Deemings. Looking to investigate whether Deeming may have been responsible for other homicides, Considine and Causey found a dinner invitation from a small village located approximately 14 kilometers from Liverpool, England, known as Rainhill, at the Commercial Hotel. Authorities cabled Liverpool to investigate the dinner. Local police inquiries led them to a woman named Mrs. Mather, who owned a news agency. Mrs. Mather also happened to be the mother of Emily Williams Deeming, the young woman found beneath the cement on Andrew Street. Mrs. Mather collapsed when detectives informed her that they discovered her daughter's body. Mrs. Mather also stated that she rented property in the area as well, and the authorities should make inquiries into the property that Williams rented in Rain Hill. When police finally investigated the goings-on in Rain Hill, they discovered that a man matching Deeming's description rented a house named the Dyneham Villa for his employer, a Colonel Brooks, whom Williams expected would be arriving in the area soon from India. The colonel never materialized. When Deeming awaited the arrival of his alleged employer, he stayed very comfortably in the Commercial Hotel, and every night while there he went to the bar and regaled those who would listen with tales of his global travels. Deeming met Emily Mathers while in Rain Hill, and after a whirlwind courtship, the two were married on September 22, 1891. Before the two departed on a lavish honeymoon to Australia aboard the Kaiser Wilhelm II, Deeming held an expensive party while still owing thousands of pounds in bills to creditors in Rain Hill and London. Before Deeming and his new bride left for Australia, residents in the area remembered the children who used to play around the Rain Hill residence, and then, all of a sudden, they were not there. After hearing several of his stories, local authorities in Liverpool made their way to the house and broke in. What they discovered was a most pungent odor.
that of death. When they discovered the source of the malodorous aroma, authorities began digging at the fireplace. They used crowbars and shovels to get through the hearthstones and the earth beneath. To their horror, they uncovered
the bodies of a woman and 2 children, all in an advanced state of decomposition. The corpses were wrapped in oilcloth. The woman lay upon her back, while the 2 children were turned with their faces downward, lying one on each side of her.
Even after authorities dug up the decomposing corpses, the smell still permeated throughout the house. In continued searches and digging, the police found 2 additional bodies, those of children, one, a small infant, and another small girl at the woman's feet. The woman and the 9-year-old girl were strangled, and the other children suffered throats that had been cut very deeply. As news of the discovery spread throughout England, 2 men came forward and identified the dead woman as Marie James, the wife of their brother, Frederick Deeming, and the children discovered underneath the hearthstone as being the children of Deeming and James. Deeming and his wife, Marie, returned from Australia with the young infant in tow and visited his brothers on the way to Rainhill. Since he returned, that was the last time they saw of their sibling and his family. With the discovery of the bodies at Rainhill, just a short 2 weeks after the discovery of Emily Mather in Australia, police felt more pressed to interrogate Deeming than ever before. Authorities took Deeming under armed escort from Southern Cross to Perth for an extradition hearing. If successful, Deeming would return to Victoria in order to answer the charges of murder in the case of Emily Mather. During the 5-day trip from Southern Cross to Perth, Deeming was said to have fainted 3 or 4 times and claimed a lack of appetite. Over the long journey, police escorts kept watch over him and never removed his handcuffs. When the train arrived at the small town of York, the town gathered around the station to, quote, see the man they heard slaughtered his entire family and a second wife, end quote. When Deeming stepped into the daylight, he raised his manacled arms and shouted, quote, ladies and gentlemen, you need not look at me. I am not guilty, but I have been victimized, end quote. At the next stop, Perth, the crowd grew so large waiting for the accused murderer that the train had to stop ahead of Perth, and the prisoner was taken in a waiting van the rest of the way into the waterside lockup. When the prisoner arrived at the lockup, an inventory of his belongings contained a few photos, a silver case with Emily engraved upon the lid, a double photo frame with a photo of Deeming and the other side containing the photo of a cute 6-year-old girl, and the last photo in the separate frame that contained the photo of a father, a mother, and 3 children. Interestingly, the inventory's trunk also contained a small timetable for trains to and from Rainhill and St. Helens Junction. And then the authorities inventoried a small battle axe with a very sharp blade, a mason's apron with the initials FBD monogrammed on the front of it, and a small common prayer book. Furthermore, the trunk contained a set of various knives. On March 24th, the Perth Police Court arraigned Deeming. His attorney, Richard Haynes, QC, desperately fought the extradition request, stating that his client would not receive a fair trial in Melbourne as, quote, the angry mob that had formed outside the Perth courthouse demonstrated, end quote, angered by the very thought that this prisoner actually murdered 2 women and 4 innocent children. The judge in the case took the argument under consideration and then granted the order of extradition. On March 27, 1892, Deeming, Detective Causey, 3 armed police officers, and 2 reporters boarded the train to Midland Junction outside of Perth to make the 250-mile journey to Albany in southwest Australia with the ship SS Ballarat for the next leg of the journey to Melbourne. On their first stop, the train took on more coal and water. What the police escorts were unaware of was that someone telegraphed ahead to alert the population at the stop that the train contained the accused killer. By the time the train arrived in York, a large crowd stood ready to confront the prisoner. Many of the women in the crowd yelled, quote, lynch him, end quote, quote, drag him out, end quote, and pull him out by the bullocks, end quote. The armed escort and Detective Causey became so concerned as to whether there would be any extra-legal action
that the shutters on Deeming's car had to be closed in order to conceal his location on the train. At this point in time, the crowd, not fooled at the concealment, pushed on the train and someone from the other side threw a brick through the window. Deeming became very scared and begged the officers in the compartment to protect him from the maddened ensemble. The train then pulled from the station, headed to the next stop. On their way to the next stop, Deeming seemed to have a, quote, fit, end quote, so to speak, where he thrashed around violently to the point where it took 4 men to hold him down until the conniption subsided. With his head badly bruised and swollen from the episode, the officers determined that Deeming may have tried to escape with this fit, but when he saw that it failed, he resigned himself to his fate. When the train finally arrived in Albany, the police escorts made sure that the incidents that occurred at past stops did not occur when they arrived near the prison. The prisoner transfer occurred without any further incident. Detective Causey and other officers planned to stay in the jail overnight, transporting the prisoner the following morning to the SS Ballarat, finally making their way to Melbourne. When they awoke the next morning to take charge of their prisoner, the guards noticed something very odd. The attribute that eventually led to Deeming's capture was gone, shaved off of the prisoner's face with the edge of a broken medicine bottle found in the cell. Later, guards discovered that Deeming plucked 75% of the hairs from his face before using the broken bottle to shave the rest. Deeming accomplished this even under the watchful eyes of round-the-clock surveillance in his cell to make sure that he did not harm himself. Detective Causey expressed concern regarding the removal of Deeming's mustache, as it altered his appearance greatly and would have helped the prosecution's case. Now, the prisoner looked completely different. When the party arrived in Adelaide, the officers guarding Deeming learned that a large crowd already gathered at the docks waiting for the suspect. Rather than attempt to board a train with their charge and risk his abduction and lynching, Detective Causey and the other officers decided to take the ship all the way to Melbourne. When the journey continued, Detective Causey noted that Deeming became very moody and began to comprehend the hatred and animus toward him. Deeming stated to one of the police escorts, quote, "They might wait until I'm found guilty. Many innocent men have been hanged. I'm not afraid to die. If I have to die, I die like a man. But first I'll make sure some revelation that will astonish the world." End quote. On April 2nd, 1892, at approximately 9 a.m., the Ballarat anchored in Port Phillip Bay, and the police escort immediately brought Deeming to the police court where he stood for the charge of murdering Emily Mather Williams. When asked to give his name, Deeming refused to answer the court, and therefore the court charged him under the name of Albert Williams. Deeming's trial began on May 2, 1892 in Melbourne, Australia. The defense counsel alleged that the defendant was insane at the time of the crimes. However, 6 mental health professionals examined Deeming at the time, some as many as 6 examinations, and none of them could state with any certainty that Deeming was, in fact, insane. The trial lasted a total of 4 days, and the evidence appeared beyond a reasonable doubt that Deeming murdered Emily Mather. When other medical doctors testified, they stated that Deeming suffered from epileptic fits that may have been caused by his advanced infection of venereal disease that may have, certainly, affected his mind and thinking processes. Doctors mentioned that Deeming exhibited moodiness, was, quote, loquacious, and fantasized about his past, end quote. The defendant even went so far to say that his dead mother ordered him to kill wife Emily Mather, and that, quote, sometimes he had been overwhelmed by the irresistible impulse to slaughter the current lady in his life, end quote. A prison physician, Dr. Shields, presented his findings to the court when he testified,
I have frequently conversed with him but cannot believe anything he says.
As to whether Dr. Shields believed that Deeming knew the difference between right and wrong, Dr. Shields added,
That stealing, for example, was a matter of conscience. Murder also permissible in certain circumstances.
Dr. Shields concluded by saying that Deeming related that often he would go out at night armed with a pistol to kill the women that gave him venereal disease. Deeming, who always believed that grandstanding was the best method to get people to believe him, took the stand in his own defense.
The gallery exhibited fascination with the man in front of them, who may have been responsible for the murder of 6 people, including 4 children. The accused sometimes closed his eyes as he related how the public prejudged him before the trial. With this publicity in mind, Deeming asked the jury if there were 200 people in Australia that would not convict him. Deeming then went on to say that Emily Mather was not dead. The defendant continued to profess his innocence throughout the testimony. Although there may have been some sympathy throughout the beginning of his testimony, that sympathy died quickly as Deeming bragged about his travels and exhibited, quote, an insatiable ego, end quote, with his descriptions. The impression that Deeming left with the gallery and jurors was one of a sane man obsessed with his own existence and the ability to eliminate any person who got in his way from achieving even the most deviant desires, that with the fairer sex. The ruse that Deeming tried to portray fell short of the mercy the jury was willing to give in this case. The verdict they rendered was guilty. After a failed appeal to the Privy Council, Deeming was hanged at the Melbourne Gaol on May 23, 1892. After death had been certified, prison officials shaved the hair from Deeming's head and face and then made a death mask. On the next day, prison officials moved Deeming's body to an unmarked grave at the Old Melbourne Gaol, then moved his body to another unmarked grave at the Pentridge Gaol.
Because of the most recent research that suggests Deeming was Jack the Ripper, his antics have resurfaced to give us one more suspect among the myriad of others. Deeming murdered his wives and children, and not in the same way as the murders of the Whitechapel killer may suggest. If Deeming were the Whitechapel murderer, it seems apropos to murder them in between the times that he murdered his wife and 4 children, as some historians have suggested. Although he did admit to Dr. Shields that he went out on the streets some nights with a pistol looking for the woman who gave him the dreaded venereal disease. But his chosen weapon was a revolver and not a sharp knife that Jack the Ripper used to dispatch his victims. Therefore, we can only add Deeming to the long list of suspects who may or may not have been Jack the Ripper. Although the courts found Deeming guilty of the murder of Emily Mather, he still paid for the crimes that he committed back in England. What we seem to forget sometimes as a society is that although someone may be responsible for the wholesale, premeditated, and callous murder of others, one death sentence is just as good as another. Until next time.
If you enjoyed our presentation of True Crime, please like, subscribe, and hit the bell to receive notifications on any future programs.
The case of a missing boy. In today's world, that particular travesty would garner the utmost attention from the authorities, knowing what fate may possibly await the child. But one case received the wrong type of attention, where the mother was deemed insane and forced to be institutionalized, when the only thing she wanted was to find her missing son. What transpired was to shock the world in its deviance and the enabling forces that allowed certain crimes to continue. On February 2, 1928, LA County Sheriff's deputies discovered a headless corpse in a burlap sack in the La Puente ditch. The teenager appeared to have been shot through the heart with a small caliber firearm. On March 28, 1928, Christine Collins gave her son, Walter Collins, some money to attend the cinema. The boy was last seen at 5 p.m. on that day by a neighbor at the corner of Pasadena Avenue and North Avenue 23 in Lincoln Heights in Los Angeles. Christine had been raising her son ever since her husband stood incarcerated in Folsom State Prison for robbery. The Los Angeles Police Department had been called out for the numerous scandals they had been involved with at this time. Christine Collins repeatedly urged the LAPD to help her find her son. However, for some reason, with the Collins case, LAPD Police Chief James Davis succumbed to a great deal of pressure to solve this case. Walter's father believed that some inmates in Folsom kidnapped his son in order to gain some sort of revenge on him for one reason or another. Walter's father's function at the prison was working in the cafeteria, where he was obligated to report any infractions of the rules that the various inmates may execute. Although there were several leads to find the child, nothing panned out. One interesting facet of the case occurred when a local gas station attendant in Glendale, California, Richard Struthers, stated that he saw the body of a young dead boy wrapped in newspaper in the back of a car when a foreign couple stopped to ask for directions. Another man, C.V. Staley, followed the couple after they left the gas station, and they eventually lost Staley when they sped out of town. When the authorities later showed Struthers and Staley photos of Walter Collins, they both identified the boy in the back of the car as indeed little Walter. Other reports came in that a couple traveled throughout California with a young boy in the back of their car who kept screaming to be released. Additionally, at approximately the same time, on May 16, 1928, two brothers, Nelson and Louis Winslow, 10 and 12-year-olds respectively, went missing while on their way home in Pomona, California. Strangely, the parents received letters from the two stating that they were heading to Mexico, and the second letter stated they were going to stay there until they became famous. At first, the authorities did not believe the Collins and Winslow cases demonstrated any connections, nor did they see any similarities between the Collins, Winslow, and the case of the headless corpse that they found in the La Puente ditch. There were reports, however, of a neighbor who witnessed a poultry farmer in Wineville, California, who had been mistreating a boy at his farm. Authorities also did not believe this connected to the other three cases as well. In August of 1928, Illinois police picked up a young boy who identified himself as Arthur Kent. When asked where the boy was from, he stated that his father abandoned the family, so authorities placed little Arthur in the care of a foster family until other relatives of the boy surfaced. After a few days, Arthur told the police his name was Walter Collins and he came from Los Angeles, and he had been avoiding their questions to protect his father. The Illinois police contacted the Los Angeles police and even sent photos of the boy claiming to be Walter. Eventually, the boy claiming to be Walter arrived in Los Angeles, and Christine Collins immediately stated that the young child was not her son. After some cajoling from LAPD Captain J.J. Jones, Christine tried out the young boy as her son. 3 weeks after the young boy claiming to be Walter stayed with Christine, she strolled into the local police precinct with her son's dental records and signed affidavits from people who knew Walter, stating that the imposter was not her son. Captain Jones immediately referred to Christine as a lunatic and attempted to get the state of California to take over custody of the boy, and he truly believed she tried to embarrass the LAPD. Christine's actions were not meant to put the LAPD in a bad light. They were already there regarding their handling of the case thus far. Captain Jones then had Christine committed to a psychiatric ward at the Los Angeles County General Hospital on what was known as a Code 12, where police could commit what they termed troublemakers by throwing them into insane asylums. As Christine sat in the psychiatric ward in September 1928, a Canadian woman named Winifred Clark communicated with American authorities and stated that her nephew, kidnapped and held her son, Sanford Wesley Clark, somewhere in California. Jessie Clark, Wesley's 15-year-old sister, became worried when her brother ventured 2 years before to live with her uncle, Gordon Stewart Northcott, age 21 at the time. Jessie then went to Northcott's farm in Wineville, California, just to make a wellness visit for her brother. Jessie learned disturbing things occurred at the farm and became very alarmed when she witnessed Northcott physically abusing her brother and believed that her uncle was involved in something very strange. At this point, when Jessie expressed her fears, Northcott abused her as well. Urged to speak with police, Sanford spoke with officers and related that his uncle did kidnap him, abuse him physically, and abuse him sexually. Sanford also related with much horror how he witnessed the torture and murder of other young boys at the farm, specifically the murders of Walter Collins, Nelson Winslow, and Lewis Winslow, along with other boys. At times, Sanford stated that his uncle forced him to participate with the abuse and the murders. Northcott, according to his nephew, abducted young boys to sexually abuse them, and when he got bored, he would lead them into the incubator room to see hatchling chicks, and then he murdered them with an axe. Northcott later covered the bodies with quicklime to enhance decomposition, then buried them. Sanford also tried to help the police in stating that he did kill a young Latino boy in La Puente. Sadly, both Sanford and Northcott murdered Walter Collins. The reason for Walter's death, according to the authorities' newest witness, was that Walter witnessed Northcott assist in the murder of another man. Sanford then stated he would lead the police to the graves of the murdered boys near the chicken coop on the farm. Once the authorities went to the chicken farm, they located axes where hair, blood, and brain matter still clung to the blades. Further digging around the farm exposed graves loaded with human bones. The bones were later identified as those of male children. Inside of the Northcott house, the authorities discovered a book checked out by one of the Winslow boys. Whistles, Boy Scout uniforms, and other materials belonging to some of the known victims were found within the house as well. Letters to parents were also discovered, possibly composed for future abductions. With all the materials they found within the Northcott compound, nothing there at the time connected Walter Collins' disappearance to Northcott. The only thing authorities did not find at the Northcott farm was Northcott himself and his mother. They fled just as the police made their way to the farm. Northcott's father, Cyrus George Northcott, informed the police that his son already admitted to the murders before he and Louise Northcott left town. Cyrus Northcott knew his son exhibited a sort of perversion, and he and Louise Northcott purchased the farm for their son to work in the hopes that his habits would change. Most importantly, Cyrus Northcott informed police that Clark's story of the farm was trustworthy. Police arrested the elder Northcott and held him as a material witness. Although the LAPD kept insisting that Christine Collins had her son back, she refused to believe that this young changeling was her son. Only after the handwriting of little Walter and the changeling had been compared, it demonstrated that a great fraud had been perpetrated upon Christine Collins. After a while of continued questioning, the fake Walter admitted several aliases. This young boy, Arthur Hutchinson, assumed Collins' identity in an attempt to go to Hollywood to meet his then idol, Tom Mix. After this admission, Hutchinson's mother came out from Illinois and collected the boy from Los Angeles, returning home. Arthur Hutchinson had no remorse and lacked any contrition at portraying a missing child and playing a trick on a bereaved mother. Subsequent to Hutchinson's return to Illinois, hospital administrators released Christine Collins from their care. On September 21, 1928, with authorities in all the western states and Canada searching for him for weeks, Gordon Stewart Northcott was arrested in British Columbia along with his mother Louise. As the two sat in a Canadian jail, a grand jury in Los Angeles County indicted the two for murder and charged them accordingly. Throughout the ordeal of discovery and the fight for extradition, Northcott denied having anything to do with the murders. In December, LAPD authorities brought Northcott back to the farm, and upon arriving there, he verbally confessed to the 5 murders, including the Winslow brothers, Walter Collins, and a 15-year-old Mexican boy named Jose Ayala. The confession to Ayala's murder was taken down in written form. Louise Northcott confessed to delivering the final blow to Walter Collins with an axe. Mrs. Northcott then buried young Walter in a hole dug in the chicken coop. Police later discovered that Louise would do anything to help her son. That even involved murder. Sanford Clark stated that his grandmother related that if he even touched one of the boys, he would also be complicit in their deaths. The trial of the state of California versus Gordon Stewart Northcott began in January 1929. One of the bizarre facets of this case occurred when Northcott insisted that he represent himself rather than accept the representation of some very knowledgeable attorneys, especially those who had been involved with murder trials previously. Northcott complained that his life had been threatened while he awaited trial in jail. Although Northcott maintained that he may be insane, alienists Drs. W.B. Wells and Dr. M. Webster determined that the defendant exhibited no traits of insanity. As the old saying goes, he who represents himself has a fool for a client. Northcott demonstrated no acumen of courtroom decorum nor any protocols when it came to questioning witnesses. Through Sanford Clark, Northcott hoped that his questioning of the youth would demonstrate that the bones found at the farm were those of animals rather than human. When the defendant asked the questions, he added to the witness's testimony that he remembered having 3 dogs on the farm that died and eventually buried them on the property. Later in the trial, when Northcott brought his mother to the stand to testify, Louise Northcott stated that she was not Gordon Northcott's mother. The defendant's real mother was Winifred Clark, the defendant's aunt. This caused a massive controversy within the court, but no other corroborating evidence surfaced during the trial to substantiate Mrs. Northcott's assertions. On February 8, 1929, after sending deputies on several wild goose chases to the farm time and again, Northcott stood convicted of 3 counts of murder and faced the gallows. When the jury reached their verdict, they recommended no mercy upon the defendant. The deputy district attorney at the time of the conviction, Earl Redwine, stated, "Northcott was the lowest of all humans, a diabolical wretch who was the worst fiend Riverside County ever had the misfortune to harbor. He has forfeited all right to live, but if I thought that life imprisonment meant life imprisonment, I might consider such a verdict." Redwine elaborated that in order for the people of California to make sure that Northcott received his just punishment, he must be sentenced to death, as a future parole board would release the killer back into society within a few years. The residents of California would not tolerate a monster walking on their street when he took the lives of innocent young children. The judge in the case actually agreed and sentenced Northcott to hang by the neck until he was dead. In September 1929, the California Supreme Court gave leave to Northcott's counsel to file briefs in favor of a new trial. The Supreme Court also ruled that the judge at the trial level should have appointed another counsel for the defendant after Northcott fired his attorney. Even though this may have been a procedural faux pas, the Supreme Court reluctantly denied a new trial for the murderer. The day before his scheduled execution, on October 1, 1930, Christine Collins went to the prison to speak with Northcott regarding the disappearance of her son. Christine believed that her son was still alive and attempted to get any details from the convicted murder. Christine Collins stated that the interview with Northcott was worse than useless. Also on this day, Northcott said goodbye to his parents. At approximately 10 a.m., Gordon Stewart Northcott walked from the death cell to the foot of the gallows. The young murderer, who so defiantly stood before the court and denied any involvement in the murders of the young boys at his family farm, walked with limited bravery to the gallows and then began sobbing before climbing the steps. 3 prison guards had to take a firm grasp of the condemned man and escort him up the steps to his punishment. At 10:10 a.m., Northcott fell through the trap door, snapping his neck. At another part of the prison, his mother, Louise, could be heard sobbing uncontrollably. In 2008, Clint Eastwood directed the fact-based drama Changeling. The movie was based on the events surrounding the Wineville Chicken Coop murders, but focused on Christina Collins, who was portrayed by Angelina Jolie. Although the film focused on the struggle of Christina Collins, the murders were slightly center stage, as that was the reason young Walter disappeared. In examining the criminal behavior of Gordon Stewart Northcott, he would have not eluded law enforcement for long had his mother not enabled his behavior. Truly deviant, and one can say slightly demented, Northcott's psychopathy can only be characterized as a perverted proclivity. We've seen this before on True Crime Man's Dark Imagination, but never where cases intersected with such a powerful story of a mother who just wanted to find her missing son through a sea of corruption and incompetence. After the execution of her son, Sarah Louise Northcott spent 4.5 years at San Quentin Prison and the rest of her time at Talachpi Prison for Women, where she left in 1940. Louise Northcott then went to Maryland, where Cyrus had purchased a farm, and lived there until Cyrus died in April 1944, and Louise followed him in November, respectively. Subsequently, Christina Collins filed a lawsuit against J.J. Jones and won a judgment of $15,000. Unfortunately, a judgment that Jones never paid. Christina Collins died in 1964, never admitting that little Walter was dead.